So good morning. Welcome to the second day of the RA Enhancements Workshop to discuss the revised straw proposal. We had a lot of good discussion yesterday. In fact, we weren't able to cover the last two topics, so we added those to the agenda this morning. So again, we have Chris Devon, Lauren Carr, and Carl Mewson who are going to be presenting. Who will be joining us later, and they're going to go over the, so first off, Chris is going to talk about the planned outage process enhancements and then the RA import provisions, and then Carl will talk about flexible resource adequacy, and then Lauren in the afternoon will cover local resource adequacy, and then Gabe will cover the backstop capacity procurement provisions. And then I'm going to go over the next steps for this initiative at the again, we are recording these sessions. We're going to make those recordings available out on the initiative webpage. That's also where you'll find the revised straw proposal as well as the presentation that we'll be reviewing today. We are going to take Q&A throughout the day. So again, for the folks in the room, just please remember to use your microphones and introduce yourselves first. If you have any mic issues, I have extras up here. I have handhelds. You can also borrow your neighbors. Hopefully we don't encounter any issues, but just in case we do, feel free to grab your neighbors or ask for a microphone. And then the folks on the phone, we are going to take questions as well. We're going to start with the room and then go to the phone. If you have a question on the phone, you can press #2 to enter the queue. And again, if you can start by introducing yourself, that would be helpful for all the participants. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us again for another long day of fun RA enhancements discussion. I'm expecting a much lively feedback just like yesterday. Okay, so I'm going to start off today going over the planned outage process enhancements. So a little bit of background initially on our planned outage provisions. We have our planned outage substitution obligation tool, which we'll say referred to as POSO frequently throughout these slides. We use that process for our planned outage substitutions. We currently have the CAISO outage system where folks can enter these outages, and then CIRA runs a daily POSO report that determines if there's a need for planned outage substitution. Resources can submit these outages between 25 and 8 days before the outage for POSO consideration, and then we actually take a look at the total amount of operational RA capacity and compare that to the total RA system requirement. And then basically if we have excess, then the planned outage does not require substitution. And we do that on a first in, last out basis. So if you're the first one to submit for that time frame, you would be the last one to be required to provide substitution. So this is the current timeline for how we do the planned outage process. Just for background, and again, it starts at 25 days before the start of the month, and then runs through T-8 or 8 days before the actual outage. So that's the difference between the lettering here, start of the month minus 25, and then T-8 on that specific. Okay, so some of the modifications we have in mind that we proposed, we got stakeholder feedback on the POSO process and planned outage provisions over the course of our initial straw proposal. And most stakeholders were interested in redesigning the framework so that we could do a few of the following things: encouraging resource owners to enter outages early, generally avoiding canceling any approved outages to the extent possible, identify specific replacement requirements for resources, allowing for owners to self-select replacement capacity, and then also the addition of some kind of a CAISO system for procurement of replacement capacity as well. So we heard you guys and your feedback, and we're proposing a few different outlining of some of the changes here. First off, development of a planned outage calendar to try to provide some transparency. Hopefully that can allow for folks to have some additional certainty around if their outage would be approved without replacement. And then also some of the other things we're going to propose that we're going to talk about today are requiring comparable substitute capacity. That's an initial proposal that we put out. Development of the substitution capacity bulletin board. So that's, in response to stakeholders asking for some way of procuring capacity through for substitution, and then some other revisions to the timing of the POSO process. So the first thing we're going to talk about is redesigning the POSO tool to base substitution requirements on the UCAP requirement rather than the NQC requirement. So we're just basically going to be changing that to look at how much UCAP we really have rather than how much NQC we're going to have. So that's just in alignment with the other aspects of the proposal for incorporating forced outages into the counting rules and creating UCAP numbers and requirements. Okay. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric from Medicine. So your last bullet on they'll be required to provide UCAP substitute capacity. If they don't, will the ISO be doing a backstop and charging it to that resource?
That's a good question. So I'm going to hold off on that until we talk more about the CPM aspect later this afternoon, and Gabe will probably touch on all that stuff, but I don't want to get crosswise on that part of the proposal because I forget off the top of my head. But I believe that we would be ensuring that there would be enough capacity through some type of mechanism. I think in that case it would be a exceptional dispatch CPM most likely. I think if we needed to get additional capacity, but I don't know for sure if we would be immediately doing, sorry. And so now I remember. So this part of the proposal, we would simply, if there was not sufficient UCAP capacity provided by that LSE, then we would need to, by that resource owner, we would need to, do some kind of a CPM or something if necessary, but that would only be like an ED. It wouldn't be something where we'd have to do it. And then if the resource decides they still want to take a planned outage, even though we said we require substitution, but they didn't provide it, then we would start to count that as a kind of a forced outage. So it would be going against their UCAP value in the future. And that is, I think we touched on that a little bit in the slides here as well.
Okay, and second question on this, will you also then bring in the BPM process in which the ISO has decided that having a planned outage turned into a forced outage has the potential to be the provision of false information to the ISO? Because this process seems to basically suggest that you know exactly what's going to happen and you have mechanisms to deal with it, and it's not necessarily providing false information. It's just that's the process that it goes through. So it would be nice to have clarity on that and a bit cleaner process for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good statement. We're going to need to think about, how that current process and change that we put in place to that PRR is going to, need to flow into this proposal because it is going to be a change, and so we need to coordinate that. The reasons why we've done those things today is because of immediate needs that we saw. So I think that's really the driver behind that change that we just put in place. But this is contemplating that this would be a change to that paradigm where we would have, the ability for folks to just simply say, okay, look, I need to take this outage regardless, and maybe even if it impacts my future UCAP or my forced outage rate. So I think we would need to change the tariff again as part of this proposal to incorporate that concept and say, look, it's okay if you guys want to, take take your plan and turn it into a forced outage. So we do need to talk with legal and our current, coordinate with our current process that we're working through with that BPM change. So, but thanks for flagging that because that is a related issue.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go to the back of the room before you, Brian. Sorry, Grant.
Yeah, this is Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. Chris, can you clarify on this POSO change? Will this be applied to lowest system resources or just system?
So we're still contemplating that. I think that's a good question related to some of our, prior discussions yesterday as well. But I think, the idea that we would, use the UCAP for POSO is essentially at this point just still situated in the system RA, obviously related to the same discussions we had yesterday about, should local be utilizing the UCAP concept as well. So we do need to think more about that before we put out a concrete proposal on exactly how this planned outage process would work in regards to that.
So if it did not, though, the reality of the situation is that a local resource would have to would have to pass two tests here, one for NQC, but also at a system level ensure that you also met your UCAP.
Yeah, and that might be the result of this. If we keep going down that path, we might have to, incorporate an additional layer of check there if it was shown for system and local. So, there is that additional complexity when you're talking about the overlapping system and local concept. But good question, and I think we're going to think more about that. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Brian Taker with NRG. Just my understanding is that if the ISO has identified a substitution obligation in the POSO and the resource owner cannot provide or does not provide substitute capacity, the ISO's first remedy would be to cancel or to disallow the outage. I just want to be clear about that before that would happen before any consideration of backstop procurement would happen. Do you agree?
Yes, and I think we would also consider it if we needed to really do any type of a CPM, and if not, I think we may cancel it as a planned outage, but then we may need to update these provisions again to allow for you to simply take a forced and then have that impact your forced outage rate in the future. So.
Yeah, I agree with Eric. It's important to think through that, so I support that.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Chris, it's Mark Smith with Calpine. First of all, thanks for reviewing the whole outage planning mechanism. We at Calpine are continuously frustrated by the fact that we do not know in advance whether there's a substitution requirement necessary. As a result, what we will often do when we have a planned outage, even when it's an approved planned outage, is go by replacement capacity, because we don't want to be in the position T-minus 20 days of having a replacement obligation pop up long after the liquidity of the RA market has closed out and have an obligation. That has two effects. It drives up our costs, which you may not be too sensitive about, I understand, but it also takes RA capacity out of the market and makes the market tighter than it probably needs to be. So I understand there's a lot of moving pieces in this 156 slide deck, but from Calpine's perspective, it would be very, very helpful if we could really focus in on ensuring that when outages are approved, the entity knows whether there's a replacement obligation or not, and that obligation, whether it be actual or zero, not change over the duration then until the outage is scheduled to begin. So a special focus on outage planning from our perspective would be very, very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think, I would say we certainly are, reflecting on costs that folks have, cost concerns, and we are concerned with that as well. And I also just, would note that we really do hear loud and clear that folks want additional certainty related to planned outages and the whole process. So I think we're trying to provide that to the extent possible through this part of the proposal. The planned outage calendar concept that we'll go over, hopefully that should provide some additional transparency and certainty as well. But again, if folks have additional thoughts on this, we do seek more feedback on how to enhance this further, to try to address some of those concerns. All right, let's keep going on. Again, so this is just going over the POSO tool, continuing to use the POSO tool to approve these planned outages. Again, it's on a first in, last out basis. And then you can also, generators that want to go on outage can also, self-select substitute capacity, to your point, Mark, that you guys buy substitute capacity ahead of time, just in case there is a need for it for these planned outages. But then we're also going to develop this additional bulletin board where we, allow for folks to hopefully be able to procure additional substitute capacity on an easier basis than perhaps if they're trying to do it bilaterally. This part of the slides is going to go over part of our proposal that we're initially putting out there to adopt requirements that ensure comparable resources are provided for planned outage substitution. Now, this is related to, kind of the discussions we've had previously about needing to ensure enough energy throughout all hours of the day, all hours of the month. And what we're proposing is that only certain resources could be acceptable for substitution with other resources that are take planned outages. So, an extreme example would be, if perhaps a nuclear plant needed to go on a planned outage for refueling or something, and substitution was provided with, solar resources or something that maybe was fuel limited, and that kind of a situation can present some reliability challenges. So that's really, just an example of what might happen that the ISO is concerned about and is driving this part of the proposal. So the idea is that we would limit the replacement resources that could qualify for meeting a POSO requirement to try to be more comparable with the actual resource that's going on outage. And again, this is, due to this transition to the fleet with more, variable use limited resources, and now that we're going to be using the portfolio analysis tool, we want to make sure that, if there is planned outages, that we don't get something that's totally different and not as reliable as a substitution for these planned outages. Sure, Eric, go ahead.
Eric from Edison. So that section kind of brings up a lot of the discussion from yesterday, and I thought about this quite a bit overnight. I think we really need to figure out whether we're going to replace MCC buckets with some other sort of a methodology to ensure that you have the right resource fleet and not strictly rely upon some sort of a test and model that gets done by the ISO after the fact that the utilities have, the LSEs have very little information on whether or not their fleet is going to make it acceptable. I think that we do need to probably sit down and figure out some rules for what variety of resources an acceptable portfolio would contain, so that entities know that if they meet those numbers, they are held harmless for anything that happens after that. And this kind of does the same thing. If I have a resource that goes on outage and I need to substitute it with something else, I need to know what that something else has to look like to be able to be acceptable, rather than play the bring me a rock game. So I think that we really need to talk about the MCC buckets and what we do with those. I think that in my opinion, I think the PUC would be open to discussing that, because we've already had discussions over the past few years on whether the MCC buckets are working, whether or not they should be deleted, whether they should be replaced with something else. So now seems to be the right time to do it.
Thanks for the feedback, Eric. I think we do need to think about, exactly how we would provide some guidance for this. And so we do have some helpful parts of the proposal on this item. Some of those other things we're going to have continuing discussions on. But when we go through these slides, you'll see one of the tables we have in mind for, kind of the types of requirements that we would look at to hopefully maintain that comparability for any substitution for this piece of it. So with that, I'm going to keep moving along on these slides. The idea here, again, about this reflecting comparability for, planned outage replacement. Again, we're focusing this on availability and capabilities of these resources, not as so much on the particular technology or fuel type of the resource to avoid any, discrimination concerns there. So the things we are exploring that we think we're going to propose to have as comparability type of requirements would be making sure that they're comparable for different types of categories, such as the location, use limitation, availability limitation, runtime duration, and ancillary services capabilities. So those are kind of the categories that we're thinking about. And I think, so here's a table here that we have on the next slide, kind of that we're thinking about what categories, and then what kind of issues we would actually consider in reviewing these things to approve if they were, comparable enough in the ISO's view. So, things like, is it located in the same TAC area or local area? For use limitations, does it have a use limitation status? for availability, things like, the number of starts per day, number of consecutive days of operation, runtime duration, and then other things for ancillary services like spin, non-spin, reg up, reg down, and, if for runtime duration, that one is also, we're looking at basically, do you have the same amount of runtime duration at your full PMAX or NQC output? So, perhaps if you had a large battery with a lot of megawatt hours output, and then you substitute it with a shorter duration battery, that might not work for us. So those are the kind of things that we're proposing to take a look at under this process and trying to propose some more specific requirements. Again, the devil's in the details, and it does get to be, a bit difficult to put extremely precise guidelines on these with all the different types of resources, but this is the initial proposal that we're thinking about here on this concept, so we're seeking feedback on these. Our operators were keenly interested in ensuring that we at least had these kind of categories included for our initial proposal. Any questions on that stuff? Brian, go ahead.
Chris, Brian Thaker with NRG. So I'm realizing that you guys are early on in this process, but just trying to get an idea. So, for example, for AES certification, do you envision that this would be kind of a binary certification, that you'd look for whether a resource is certified to provide the same AES as the resource for which substitution is being provided, or do you think it's going to get as granular as does it provide the same quantity of that particular type of AES?
I think that's a good question. I don't think we've got to that level of detail yet, so I think we're seeking feedback. I think it might be a little bit difficult to get to that level of granularity. I think some folks have, talked about, could you use more than one resource to substitute to provide more, comparability, things like that. Those are some of the details we really need to think hard about, and we're seeking more feedback on. So I think we're open to how to really, work the process to make sure that we get what we need, and we'll have to review anything that, stakeholders provide for feedback with our, operations and engineering and make sure that it will work for them as well. Mark, please, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Mark Smith with Calpine. I think I understand why you're doing this. I think I understand the purpose. The purpose is to make sure that you can meet the UCAP requirements and the duration of generation or load service that you need. But I also understand that as units retire or shut down because of once through cooling, that scheduling outages is going to get more and more difficult. There's no doubt about that. But the more granular you get, you're going to get to a breaking point. I mean, just take a very simple example of an 800-megawatt gas-fired power plant in a local area. If you were to apply all of these limits, the only way you could ever take an outage is if you can find another 800-megawatt gas power plant in that same local area. At some point, this thing's going to break down, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that.
Well, I hear you loud and clear there, Mark, but I would also just suggest that, when we are trying to develop this planned outage calendar, that we're trying to, be more transparent and allow for folks to know ahead of time, when they really could take these without having replacement. So I think that would be my initial, solution to your statement and opinion there. But I think, it is fair to think about some of these, additional complexity that would be created by this. So we do need to try to weigh both those things.
Yeah, and that's great, Chris. And if you can confirm me 3 months in advance or 6 months in advance that I have a firm outage window and I won't need to replace, it solves the problem. But I don't know until T-20 if I have a substitution requirement, even according to your new proposal. I understand that all this stuff is moving and you're trying to work it out, but we have to design something that allows people the certainty that they can take an outage when it's set up originally and approved. Carl, you had something to add, sorry.
Yeah, Mark, this is Carl from the ISO. As Chris noted, we're working on providing greater transparency with the calendar, and as far as what we can push out further, it gets down to how often are we going to be doing planned outage assessments, 3 months in advance. I don't know that we're at this time prepared to commit to saying we're going to be doing that same assessment 90 times. With the local questions and some of the challenges that come with local, we've always recognized that local is kind of a unique beast, and that there's, the ability to provide you certainty 90 days in advance, particularly for local. I don't think we're going to ever get to a place where we can do that. But on top of that, we recognize there's going to be few options in local areas to allow you to go find that substitute capacity, so it's going to really require very close coordination with the ISO and kind of knowing what our system topology is going to look like for that outage duration so that we can get through it. We can't say you can't take an outage or we can't figure a way out to facilitate an outage in a local area. It doesn't move anybody in the long run to say you can't do it. But I don't know that we're going to move into the time frame that you're looking for to say we're going to lock you down, you're good to go take that outage 90 days in advance, particularly in local areas. It's just there's too many unknown factors that far out.
Okay, then 30 days in advance, but no revision requirement, right? No ability to look at it on 29 days before to say, oh shit, yeah, you need to replace that 800 megawatt plant.
Okay.
Because then we're just going to say we can't do it. We're going to have to cancel all the outage management, wheels that we put in place.
Yeah. No, we understand the complexities that come with this. We'll look into like 22 or 23 days. You're going to counter with 27, and then anyhow. We'll continue to explore like what the time frame is that we have sufficient comfort about adequate transmission and generation availability to lock that in. Right now, it's 20 days. So anyhow, we'll go to Vic in the back of the room.
Vic Ruder, San Diego Gas Electric. I think this goes back to the point about are some of these penalties just punitive? I know you have all these problems and such, and you understand that there may not be any substitution, but hitting someone with a substitution and then or a big penalty, if they can substitute, really isn't improving the system or doing something. So there should be a small penalty or some incentive that you're not gaming the system and not trying to plan your outages and do everything to the best of your ability. But if you've done that, you shouldn't be hammered for it. And I think that framework can be adjusted such that it's not as painful as it is currently.
So Vic, could you expand on that a little bit? I don't quite follow exactly what penalties you're talking about. Is it just simply the replacement requirement? Or is it RAIM, or are you talking about something else?
All of them together, all the penalties with RAIM, if it's not RAIM exempt, and you really did your best, and you told us we could take this outage, but we really need it, or we tried to move it off, and then it turned into a forced outage. I mean, you got this whole paradigm now that was moving towards a tariff violation, and that's really scary for a lot of people, and that's why some people will do the substitution or hold back capacity, and it's not. The whole framework is to manage risk. I mean, the whole market is there really to manage the risk. So,
okay, thanks for that clarity. I appreciate that, Vic. We will certainly, think about that and consider those kind of things in our, adjustments to the proposal in the future. All right. Any other questions? Oh,
yeah,
Jamie, go ahead.
Jamie, CPUC. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So what additional certainty are you providing? You're not changing the timeline regarding outage, like when they would cancel an outage. So a generator or a scheduling coordinator for a generator would still face the same uncertainty up to T-8. Is that correct? Regarding whether or not the ISO could cancel their outage?
At this point in time, that is the current proposal, but we also, are trying to improve some transparency related to that calendar that we'll talk a little bit about, where, folks could see ahead of time how much headroom we might have, so they might have additional, clarity around their ability to take a planned outage without requiring replacement at all. And that could hopefully help provide some additional certainty if folks, get in there as one of the first outages on a date where we already have a lot of headroom. But I think at this point we aren't proposing to change that. We have that ability to make the determination up till that T-8 time frame.
I guess can you just kind of dive into what are the constraints with moving that out further? locking that out further in the ISO systems?
It's really more of I think, an engineering decision and our, operations folks wanting to ensure that we have enough reliability. I think that's really the major constraint there. I don't think it's like a systems constraint or anything like that. But we do have to conduct those outage studies, and we want to have the most up-to-date information. So it's really just trying to balance, ensuring we have exactly enough that we need in the operations horizon versus, the ability for folks to have planned outages approved and certainty out further, So we do have to, try to think about both sides of the equation there.
Well, isn't also part of it the fact that you don't have the data prior to the month-ahead showings in order to do the UCAP kind of analysis?
Well, yeah. So, again, having the most up-to-date data is important. I think that is a concept that we're, thinking about constantly. How can we improve this stuff? But we have certain limitations that just don't let us move out further because, we don't actually know how much has really been shown for RA until that, 45 days before the month. Then we go into the POSO process. We also want to take into account all the transmission outages and everything that could happen as well that could impact the topology on the grid, the load forecasting, everything, all the different stuff that goes into these type of analyses. We need to have that information as up to date, as accurate as possible to be able to maintain reliability. So, that's the balancing act we're talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to go back to David. It looks like he wants to say something here.
Yeah, hi, this is David from the ISO. I do want to sort of put some context around this conversation in terms of the certainty of not having the outage canceled. And I think the context of this conversation is having the outage canceled because of factors surrounding RA and the substitution requirement and all that. But I think, so that's the context of this conversation. But in terms of having an absolute guarantee, I think the ISO would still have its overall outage coordination process in place, and that outage could later be canceled for reasons, other reasons outside of this RA context we're talking about. So I don't think I'm looking at Abdul here to see if he disagrees. He agrees. Yeah, that what we're talking about is here, the sort of regular course of the RA processes, but that the ISO wouldn't be giving up, its general outage coordination authority to cancel it for other reasons. Right. Well,
and Mark, could you speak into your microphone for everyone to hear?
Well, I was agreeing. That's why I didn't do it on the microphone.
Okay. Well, when you agree, you can also put it on the recorded line.
I was just saying, of course, in the ISO, if they have a transmission outage or a major system disruption, something or other, you always have to have the right to be able to cancel outages. That
right.
That makes sense.
I think,
the difficulty, the notice that's causing the difficulty, though, is driven by the RA schedule. It's the T-20, T-22, whatever date it is. The POSO postings, that's the thing that causes us most heartburn.
Okay, well, I think, we'll sit down with that dual and team and review that time frame again and see if there's any, ability for us to move it at all. But I do think that, that is good clarity that on David's part there, that's really what we mean by these, all the way up to the last minute. But you are is well correct there, Mark, about, that time frame of the T-20, 22 time frame is driven by the RA data that we have and that process. Megan, go ahead.
This is Megan from the ISO. Jamie, to get back to your T-8 question, another consideration for that is not just the CAISO outage studies, but it's also the RC studies. And I know the CAISO is taking on part of the RC role, but part of the reliability coordinator's responsibility is to take outages from all of their balancing authority areas and run those in a cohesive study to make sure there aren't any impacts between balancing authority areas. So that's part of the process which requires that T-8 deadline.
Thanks for that. All right, let's keep going through this.
Wait, just following up. So
Jamie from the PUC.
Jamie from the PUC. So PR 1122, which was what Eric was talking about, this is the BPM that basically if you switch from a planned to a forced, it's considered a tariff violation. that you're considering looking at?
Not necessarily.
Or no?
I mean, that's a little, yeah, okay. Legal, please. Thank you, David.
Yeah, hi. That was not a correct statement of what that BPM says. But the idea, but I think most people here, a lot of people here are familiar that there is a BPM revision that went in place that addressed the plan to forced language. So that's what we're talking about. We can sort of disagree on what it meant. But I think the point of this conversation here is it's exploring ways to allow some of the conduct that is identified as suspect in that BPM. So that is what this conversation is, that there would be ways to allow that to be done in some cases. And, I think the idea is that if you have other new rules in place that address the concerns of when that activity is done, and that's what this, part of this initiative is to do, is to look at if we did say, yeah, that's fine, go ahead and do it when you want to, what other things are there on the ISO side to sort of feel confident that it's, still going to leave the ISO in a good enough place operationally. So this isn't to address that. I just disagreed with the idea that we never said it's an automatic, tariff violation, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah, and so thanks, David. And I would just simply add that, to Eric's comment earlier and to this question, by the PUC, I do think we need to make sure that any changes that we intend to make through this process are coordinated with the, current PRR updates that we have, included. And I think to David's point, we do have some additional protections here by, incorporating a UCAP concept that wasn't, previously in place. I think that could allow us to change perhaps this paradigm where we do have the ability for folks to take it as a forced outage, even though they, initially was indicated as a planned outage. And that would be a change from the current status quo. So I think we do, intend to try to coordinate those two, existing and kind of parallel tracks. And one has obviously been started and moved ahead, and this one is a longer-term solution. But the idea is we really need to coordinate those things. All right, let's keep moving along. So the planned outage calendar process that we're trying to incorporate into the proposal is going to be to have a calendar that shows the potential availability of additional system headroom on a daily basis. This could allow for resource owners that are seeking to take planned outage to do so without having to specify a substitute. If there's dates on the calendar that show that there's no RA headroom, then you would, know that if you do attempt to have a planned outage during that time frame, that we would require substitution up front without having to wait for us to, go through a whole study process and let you guys know through the POSO tool. So we're thinking about that. It's going to be based off of a UCAP number in excess of the RA requirements. This is just a simple example to show, how it might look, where, we have certain days that, like the 4th through the 6th here on this calendar that don't have any headroom. So if you attempted to take a planned outage there, a month ahead of time, you would know that those dates aren't good to try to take one, unless you have, substitution ready to go. That kind of thing. So that's the idea here. I think we have a couple questions on the phone, but first I'm going to go to Mark in the room, then go to the phone.
Thanks, Chris. I think this would be helpful, but is this headroom intended to be local capacity requirements or the UCAP?
UCAP on a system basis.
But UCAP you don't really know until the RA showing is 45 days before the month. So how do you do this?
Yeah, so this would essentially have to be, established for the month once we get those RA showings.
So it would have to be after T minus 45, which puts you outside the RA purchasing and selling window anyhow. So it would be helpful, at least from a local perspective, to see what the headroom is.
Well, I wouldn't say it necessarily puts you outside the RA selling window, because we are also going to provide this bulletin board placement capacity.
Okay, let's talk about a bulletin board. I would say that for me to go out and attempt to buy 800 megawatts of capacity on a bulletin board in a local constrained area is like spitting in the wind. It's just not going to be available. So a bulletin board is interesting, but I don't know that it really solves the problem.
That's fair. You know, I think this is an initial proposal for us, and I think if we have ideas for additional enhancements, we're open to thinking about that kind of thing. I'm going to turn it over to Carl. Looks like he has some responses.
So, again, I think what folks in the room and on the phone are hearing from the ISO is we are working on ways within certain constraints to offer greater transparency, and kind of what I'm hearing back is thanks, but that's not going to cut it. And so outside of, the request I heard earlier from you, Mark, about, if I get it in 90 days in advance, just let me know I can lock that down. We need to know what will work within the constraints we're dealing with. Again, the year ahead right now, we just don't have sufficient information, as we talked about yesterday, to do any real meaningful analytics on in the year ahead. If we're getting, 90% for, the 5 summer months, that doesn't help us. We do get the locals. We get 100% of the locals, so there may be something we can look at there. But again, we'll be asking you guys, what is it you want? And then we'll have to look at, as Megan pointed out, we've got RC studies, we've got kind of the general portfolio analyses that we're going to be working on. We've got a lot of stuff leading up to that. So understanding what you guys need to see if we can make that work is key. And so putting that in your comments is first and foremost. We need to know what it is you're asking for at a bare minimum to see what we can accommodate. And if you have thoughts on what you need.
We'll do. We'll try to put some ideas into the comments. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go to the phone first, and then we got 2 more in the room.
So, Helen, you said we had folks in the queue?
We do. The caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Doug Bochignone from Flynn Resource Consultants. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we should really think hard about whether we even need any kind of replacement requirement, because we're talking about yesterday probabilistic analysis in determining the needs. The local capacity analysis explicitly takes into consideration resource generator outages in determining what local resources are needed. So if we've already factored in outages, in setting the requirements, then when those outages occur, as they will, there's no need to go scramble to get a replacement because the resources that are backing it up are already there.
Okay, thanks for your comment. Peter?
One second. Doug, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, this gets back to a discussion you and I had yesterday about within the construct of the portfolio analysis and what we have going on there and how we're dealing with planned outages through that process. It's something we're still, I'm still chewing on that conversation from yesterday, and when we come back around on exactly what that planned outage process means, if we're using the IOC tool, which can incorporate those, what that output means. So we're still chewing on that from yesterday, and it was a good and thoughtful suggestion, and we'll have to come back around on that.
I also am just curious about the sorry to jump in, this is Chris again. On your point about the local study taking into account outages, I think it just takes into account the most major outage, but Catalan's in the back of the room. Catalan, could you help on that at all? Help clarify that? I think the question was basically, maybe you could restate it, caller, but I think you were saying, that the whole local capacity technical study takes into account for all the outages.
Yeah, my understanding is it's, in setting the requirements, it's looking at the most, the outage that results in needing the most effective resources, but that's just in what you publish. When you're actually going in, you're looking at you're solving for every single contingency, which includes the generator outages. So even though it might not have been explicitly stated as this is the particular generator outage, when you're setting the needs and then looking at all the resources that have been presented to you, you're going to, my understanding is you look and say, oh, wow, I still have a problem here, and then you'll do the backstop procurement if you think that's important. So I just think it's much more rational that to do all this stuff up front, and if that means we need to have a higher requirement up front, rather than to have everybody scrambling to get replacement resources that aren't really available, you know, as you're going into the month or within a month, just does not make sense to me, particularly when you think about market power issues. So, you know, let's come up with a solution that gets, you know, has those resources that available.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. I don't know. I guess I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Catalan, but.
Hi, everybody. This is Catalan. Maybe I misunderstood the question. So at the end, yes, we are taking the portfolio here, making sure that all the contingencies have been taken care of. We can't really do that at the beginning. That's why it's not a centralized market. It's you know, we have to come up with the requirements. The requirements are the minimum requirements, using the most effective units where people can go buy any units they want to. So ahead of time, I would not know what units they would end up buying. You know, to do all the combination possible doesn't make any sense unless we change the requirement and says we want to buy the biggest requirement, not the smallest LCR possible, but the biggest LCR possible. I guess I can do that. But, you know, that's nor here nor there.
Yeah, so, you know, there's definitely a lot of technical complexity in that local study that we do. But, you know, I think we hear the feedback about, you know, the requirements. So, you know, that's something to think about as well. I think that's also something for the PUC to consider and other LSEs, you know, to consider if that's something that, you know, could be potentially a solution to this. If we could just increase the requirements up front, I think that, you know, the CAISO could be open to something like that. You know, obviously the details matter on that. But thanks for the feedback. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more. The outage calendar thing, you know, we're going to try to provide it for the whole month. And then again, you know, as noted, there's going to be a bit of, you know, constraint on when we can actually provide these numbers. So it'll be like, you know, in advance of the month, but after we get the RA showings and they're able to, you know, run all the CIRA process that we do for that normal RA validation. And then we would be able to update this calendar. So it should be, you know, going forward on a rolling basis. Once we get those monthly showings. That's the idea there. The next slides we're going to talk about are on the bulletin board. So again, we've had previously some bulletin board concepts in place a few years back, and then more recently we were using one that was hosted by a different ISO, but we're currently building one for the CAISO itself that we would administer. The idea here is that we would you know, provide this bulletin board to help people be able to find replacement capacity if they do have a planned outage substitution obligation. So first off, resources could still voluntarily provide substitution, you know, capacity that we would list on the bulletin board. It's not, you know, a requirement or anything. It'll be on a daily basis, and then the generators that are looking to buy replacement should be able to look at this and filter it to show the substitute capacity that's really, you know, available to meet their comparability requirements, hopefully, or at least a list that indicates, you know, some of the categories of the comparability that we're looking for. And then we're also exploring the implementation to being able to, you know, allow the CAISO systems like CIRA to be able to, you know, flow this information automatically through once somebody has, you know, accepted a capacity deal with someone on the bulletin board. So this slide here is going to just give you an idea of kind of what it looks like, or what it could potentially look like, I should say. You know, and again, just trying to outline some of the categories of potential comparability here. The use limitations category, column, runtime duration limit at NQC column, if it's AES certified, what the fuel type is, maybe what local area, if it's in a local area or not, the amount of megawatts of NQC and UCAP that's available from the resource, and how much, it's offering for sale, at what price. So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about, including in this bulletin board concept. I'll pause and see if there's any questions on the bulletin board.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I guess the question I have about the bulletin board is this and I see the problem of trying to essentially of wanting to be able to have something to make sure that the substitute capacity gets put into place and is used and compensated and all of that. And I guess the question is, the bulletin board, the way the ISO is trying to make sure that that compensation takes place, because the one concern I have is that one of the stated objectives of this stakeholder process is to make sure that LSEs have the incentive to show everything that they have. And so if there is a substitution requirement that takes place after the showings have been made, and that there is a residual type of market for after the showings for substitution, then that provides an incentive for the LSEs not to show everything that they have. And so one way to get around that would be to have the ISO say, look, you show everything that you have, and you can, any excess you can put on a bulletin board, and we will make sure that what's on the bulletin board essentially is used essentially to substitute for any substitution that is needed for generators. I'm struggling to some degree with how do you have the bilateral market do the substitution, and how do you also then get the incentive for all LSEs to show everything that they have? So I think the bulletin board is a very interesting idea. Is this a voluntary type of thing, or is this something that the ISO wants to try and make a little more, bake it in and make it a little more formal in terms of any, we will take care of all the substitution that's needed, because we'll have essentially the showings from everybody and what price they're willing to transact at, and to be able to do that type of a market making. Are you pushing it that far, or are you still just trying to facilitate the bilateral?
I think initially this proposal is really trying to, continue along the path of it being a voluntary process and continue to be bilateral, and not having the ISO be in the midst of, deciding what resources are procured. But, it's an interesting concept that you present to think about. So I guess I would just wonder, my initial reaction to that would be, it sounds good, except for the idea of how much those resources would be paid and how we would actually select them. Maybe this would all be more simple if the ISO were the one who just decided, but then I worry a little bit about the payments and people worrying about things like the cost allocation and how fair that is and things like that. So I think that's kind of where we're, at least as a starting point, that's why we're saying let's do it voluntary, let's have it still continue to be bilateral. But there may be ways that this is acceptable to stakeholders, and perhaps we could adjust this to do something a little bit more to what into what you suggested, Peter.
Well, I'm just 4 slides ago or 5 slides ago you said here are the characteristics that the ISO will say thumbs up or thumbs down on what will count for substitution, not count for substitution, and to some degree, from a bilateral perspective, we're not going to know whether or not the transaction is not going to know whether or not that whatever resources available I might be negotiating with is actually going to be able to meet those until it actually gets shown and the ISO gets a thumbs up or thumbs down. It just, in my mind, it's maybe we should be thinking about something slightly more formal from the ISO's perspective. So that's the only suggestion I have. I'm not saying we should go there. I'm just saying let's think about this perhaps in a little more expansive way.
Yeah, it's something to consider. So hopefully other stakeholders, if they have opinions as well, let us know on that. I think there are potential ways to streamline some of this. So, ways that we can enhance the process, and the upcoming proposals certainly welcome that kind of feedback. Jamie, do you have any comment or no? Okay. All right. Again, this is more of a kind of an initial proposal on this bulletin board. So we are open to feedback and seeking suggestions on this. I think that we've heard a lot of good feedback today so far on the whole process. So, we will think about this and update our proposal. This is the current process right now. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Chris, Brian Decker with NRG. Yeah, this is the slide I had the question about. And sorry that this is kind of picky, but several slides above this, the ISO indicated it was focused on availability and capabilities, not fuel type. And you've got fuel type as a category. Is there something inherent in fuel type that the ISO that's important to the ISO that the ISO needs to know?
No, sorry, I apologize for that. I think that was misleading on this slide, but yeah, that was just intended to, have it be so that people who are trying to decide what they wanted to buy would know what the fuel types are. That wouldn't necessarily be something that the ISO would require for comparability. We wouldn't necessarily have a requirement that said, okay, you had a battery, it has to be another battery, or you had a, gas plant, it has to be another thermal unit or something like that. But so, and again, this is subject to change. This is just an example. So I think we could refine this if folks think that it shouldn't be on there at all. We could take that off, but I think that was just something we included. I think we need to probably think about adding a few other things like, the local area, pack area, and, column or some other stuff. So that this might get to be a little bit wider of a, bulletin board with more columns here. And again, but that's a fair question about the fuel type thing. But I don't think we're intending that, back to the other slides before, that's how we were saying, we're not going to make a requirement that you have to have the same kind of fuel type. Okay, in the back room over here.
Yes, so are this going to be both buyers and sellers on this bulletin board as well? And also, I guess, assuming this is just, these are going to be indicative prices from the bids and the offers, more or less, and subject to terms.
So initially we were thinking that this is just going to be the sellers listed, not buyers, but I think we could contemplate potential for having that included as well if there's, people seeking, replacement and putting up an offer to buy a bid for it, something like that. That might be potential enhancement that we could include in the future. So we'd welcome if folks think that that's something we should do. Welcome that kind of feedback from your entity and others. But I didn't catch your name. Sorry. Who are you with again?
Jeff Malone with Middle River Power.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Mohan?
This is Mohan Murala with CDWR. So in this table, I think if we include RA type, that would be probably beneficial because, for example, flexible category 1, flexible category 2, and local, something like that.
That's a good suggestion. Thanks, Mohan. Okay. So the next couple slides, just to wrap up this topic. This is just a diagram that kind of explains the new process, kind of in a flow chart to give folks an idea of, how it would work. It does look similar to the current process. Really the only big change here is just that the idea that it would be UCAP, for the requirement and any required substitution. You could either self-provide it or use this bulletin board. So that's really the only additional, concept here. And then the real-time part is just to, note again that if there is a need for, exceptional dispatch, that the ISO could still, procure necessary, CPM resources as needed to make sure that we maintain reliability. So that's all that this slide's really trying to get at. The next slide here on 72 is the proposed planned outage process timeline. So we're trying to update the process to incorporate the portfolio analysis time frame that we have in place. And so the idea here is, it's going to have to probably tighten down a little bit on the initial time frame that we run the POSO obligation process to 14 days out. Again, continuing with the -8 deadline for substitution capacity. And I think that's all. Oh, no, there's one more last bit on this, but any questions on the time frame? Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, Brian Taker with NRG again. Back to, if you could back up one slide, I think it's just one. Yeah, that's a useful chart, could I suggest that maybe a subsequent version of this include the issue that Eric raised and we've talked about, which is what happens in the instance where substitution is not provided? How does that process flow?
I think we can think about that. Might make this chart a little bit unwieldy, but I think we could at least describe how it would work.
Yeah, flow diagram.
You want the diagram?
Well, I know we're thinking through that process, and so it's a work in progress. But it would be interesting to see how that flow looks after the rectangle, because it is a topic of discussion.
Taking a note of it. Thank you.
It's Mark. Got one more comment on this chart. The ISO often approves outages long before it determines whether substitution is needed. So the rectangle in the middle in the planning horizon probably should be moved up before the decision point of substitution needed or not.
Yeah, so I think that probably takes place out before the whole POSO process, right? So you're talking about that kind of process. So yeah, so there is another circle decision tree part of this that actually does happen above this part of it, right? In this area, basically this whole decision, if we approve it or not, does happen above that. And then once we get into the POSO time frame, that's when we do this again, and then we say, okay, you actually need substitution because now it looks like we don't have enough RA. So there really is that double process. So we could try to add that part in here as well. Everyone will have to get a microscope out so they can read anything on the chart, on the slide. But no, but that's a fair point, Mark. I think I'm seeing shaking and nodding head from Abdul behind you. So there is that additional, approval process that happens before this. But this is really the planned outage substitution process that we're trying to talk about right here. Okay. So I think this is the last slide that we have on this topic is just, again, noting our, continued ensuring reliability remaining key, and that we're going to retain our ability to ensure that these planned outages don't cause any reliability issues, so we can continue to identify if there's any local constraints and might have to deny outages if there are, various topology issues or contingencies that occur due to these outages. And we can deny any outage even with substitute capacity for reliability reasons. And then also retaining the ability to maintain our, backstop capacity procurement mechanism after the actual outage time frame. So again, if we need to ED and CPM a unit, we can still do that. So that's just to, again, to reiterate that we are maintaining our, flexibility there on that to ensure reliability. So any other questions, comments on planned outage process at this point? Let's keep moving on through to the next imports discussion if we can. All right, anything on the phone? Operator, nothing on the phone? Okay. All right, on to the next topic. So hopefully we can try to catch up because we're still moving slowly, but there's a lot of stuff here to get through. I'm going to try to move this one pretty quickly. So the ISO has provided some proposals on our RA imports rules as well as our maximum import capability and import capability allocation process. First, I'm going to talk about clarifying the RA import rules modifications that we've proposed. Then I'll go over the MIC process enhancements after that. So first off, on the RA import rules, we wanted to clarify some of the concerns and make sure that it was clear what we were intending to try to address. There's two main issues that ISO is really concerned about here. First one being double counting. So we provided, kind of a definition or explanation of what we believe that double counting really is. And the concern is basically that CAISO needs to be able to ensure that resources that are shown for RA imports are not being relied upon by another BA or other load-serving entity to serve load or somehow otherwise sold to another third party. And it's really not possible to ensure that in some of the instances today. So that's driving some of the potential changes that we proposed. The next one is speculative supply. We've noted this previously as well, but again, sometimes we see that there could be potential for speculative supply where something has been shown as an RA import, but not specified what source it is, and then actually might not have anything secured during that time frame of between when it was shown for RA and when it was actually bidding in the market in the actual operation horizon. That this could cause, some concerns to us if they're using bidding strategies to avoid having a real-time MOO or an actual delivery obligation. We've seen some high day-ahead market bids that indicate this could be possible, but it might not be that big of a concern if it's more of an economic energy swapping type of a situation, but it is difficult for the ISO to parse out the difference between those things. So those are really the two main issues we're trying to address with some of these concepts that we're putting forth in our proposal on RA import rules. Again, some of the objectives that we talked about previously, try to create more comparable treatment for internal RA resources compared to the RA imports. Consider other aspects of the RA enhancements proposal and incorporate those into any enhancements such as the UCAP concept or different portfolio analysis issues that might be interrelated with these import rules, and then also ensuring coordination with our extended EIM and day-ahead market enhancements initiative is a final objective that I just wanted to touch on. So we did a bit more analysis on this issue, try to clarify some of the needs and concerns that we had previously. We talked about the potential concerns at some of our prior stakeholder meetings, and with our MSC, we identified that we needed to do a bit more analysis and try to, improve the analysis to make it more clear and really more accurate. So we did that a little bit before this latest proposal. But again, the idea is that we looked at the import RA showings and then the hour-ahead schedules for import resources and real-time delivered quantities. And then we said, hey, we see that there's some undelivery or non-delivery of these this energy in real time that was supposed to come from these RA imports. So it was concerning, and previously we were saying it looked like it could be, about 20% on average that these things were not delivering, but our updated analysis is showing that looking something more along the lines of like 10%. So what we did to refine this analysis is that, well, first off, I want to go over the definition here. We're defining non-delivery as a megawatt-hour quantity that did not meet their real-time schedule. So that's the idea of how we're going to compare, how much has actually been provided by these RA imports compared to what they were shown for, at least on a megawatt-hour basis. So we're trying to take snapshots in time to do this analysis to show kind of the maximum magnitude during a single hour. So that was the idea here. But one of the issues that we ran into is that when you have these non-resource specific RA imports, they can actually have a resource ID that's bidding above the amount of megawatts they've been shown for RA. And so that kind of obscured some of the analysis we did previously, and what we did was to try to scrub that, clean that up, and account for that kind of instance when we are bidding above that. So we needed to look into the day-ahead awards and double-check on that to refine this. So what we did here is just a simplified example to try to take a look at basically, the issue at hand here that we're talking about for this enhancement in our analysis. So on this slide 79, you can see that because they could get day-ahead or hour-ahead awards that were above their RA showing value, and then we observed some non-delivery from those same resource IDs. It looks like when we looked at the analysis initially, we were presenting the total gray bar there, the total non-delivery. But after we did some enhancements to this, it looks now like we can actually, limit it to exactly what the RA showing was, and then really actually look at the subset of that gray bar that's shown on the far right there, the RA non-delivery in the yellow bar. And so that's really the difference in the analysis, is just to show an example of what we really looked at. And then the result of that is that we did, on average, over the time frame we looked at, which was from June to 2017 to July of 2018, we looked at the maximum of the amount of undelivered RA imports on each month at an hourly basis. So we took the maximum amount that they weren't showing, and then we compared that to the RA showings. And it looks like, as you can see here, that we're around an average of about 10% across those months. You see a little bit of a spike in March, but other than that, it's generally hovering, around 10% or lower of the amount that we saw there. So that was driving us to kind of make some additional adjustments to our proposal, where we think, maybe it's not as large of a concern as we had prior stated. It's closer to something like, a actual, outage rate on an average resource or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why we're changing some of this. Okay, so we got a question on the phone. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Megan, then we'll go to the phone.
This is Megan from the ISO, and Chris explained this perfectly, but I just wanted to emphasize, I think it's important here to note that this 10% average is actually the 1 hour of the month with the maximum amount of non-delivery. So it's important to distinguish that it's not 10% on average of every hour of the month, it's the worst hour of the month that you have up to. It looks like the worst case for this year, or this 2-year period, was 25%, and that would be 1 hour for that month in March 2018.
Yeah, thanks for that clarity. So that is important. That is the way we were looking at it, because when you're talking about megawatt hours versus megawatts, we need to take a snapshot in time in that hour to actually get the right amount there. Actually, before we go, I'm going to go to the phone, then you.
Helen, do we have somebody in the queue?
Yes, caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Chris. This is Jeff Spires from PowerX. Thanks for the additional analysis and data that you're performing to try to gain a better understanding of some of the impacts of these issues that you've raised. I just wanted to highlight that I think we should be a little bit careful in the conclusions that are made based on the past performance of the RA imports, because as you raised in a previous slide, you've got two different issues that are related. One is an entity that simply sells an RA contract with nothing behind it. They put in a high bid into the market hoping they don't get taken, but if they do, they'll scramble around in the short-term markets and try to find that supply in the spot market. The second issue that you raised is the double counting issue, where maybe they do have a physical resource, but they've also got their own external obligations that they need to, they've got their own load that they need to meet first. If they get into a situation where market conditions are tight, they might try to buy in the spot market to backfill their own load, but if they're unable to do that, the result is they're going to be cutting that RA export to the CAISO. And really, both of those problems, though, are boiling down to the same fundamental issue, which is an entity selling forward capacity that they don't really have. And in either case, you're ending up with a reliance on the spot market. And so when we're looking at sort of the conclusions about the magnitude of this problem based on historical performance, I think we need to be careful, because as you pointed out, you don't actually know which of those RA import contracts are real and which ones aren't. And so even entities that have sold RA that don't have anything behind that might show up if there happens to be spot market supply in that hour. So they might just basically be lucky and able to purchase supply in the spot market and deliver that into the hour, into the CAISO during that particular hour. So if you look at a chart where there's, say, 500 megawatts of delivery failures in a given month, is that because 500 megawatts of that supply was speculative, or is it because 2,000 megawatts of that supply was speculative, but there happened to be 1,500 megawatts of spot market purchases available? You really can't tell from just this information how big this problem is. And the problem is that even if those speculative supply resources end up showing up in some hours, that doesn't change the fact that they never had surplus forward capacity. They're relying on the spot market to ensure the delivery, and ultimately what you're ending up with is buyers that are paying those sellers for nothing, because there's no guarantee that they're going to be there next time. And as we sort of, as we're moving forward, we're seeing the grid tightening. You don't know when you really need it, is that supply going to show up? And I think that for that reason, it's critical. This is an important topic. We really think it's important to address these gaps, because otherwise you're never going to be confident that when you need it the most, these schedules are going to be there and these resources are going to be made available. I just wanted to point that out, that we just need to be careful in looking at past performance and then making assumptions about how that's going to impact the future. Thank you.
thanks, Jeff. I think my reaction to your comments is that, CAISO is certainly very concerned with the same things you mentioned, and that, we really want to make sure that we are avoiding relying on, phantom resources, speculative supply, or double-counted resources that don't really truly represent reliability and resource adequacy. So I think some of the parts of the proposal that we have modified and put forth that we'll go over in a couple slides here really hope to address some of those concerns. And I think we also are intending to do some additional analysis related to the day-ahead bidding that we've seen on these non-resource specific RA imports as well, to try to, put a finer point on some of our justification for these proposals. And I think, when you look at, this is kind of some of the discussion we had yesterday, when you look at the, average instances, you kind of mask when there could be extreme situations. If you point out extreme situations, you could be kind of masking what's happening on average. So I think, we do intend to do some additional analysis on this and, look at some of our more stressed days and some of the day-ahead bidding that we see, because that could be a concern even under some of the proposed modifications. So I think we are looking to enhance this proposal as we go forward, but this is a good first step that we've put in place with some of the stuff that we, included related to, kind of aligning our rules and the tariff with what the PUC has in place to try to ensure that there aren't, double counted or speculative type of resources. And I think that should help as an initial starting point. And, we also have to balance the fact that, people still want to have flexibility and cost impacts as well. So thanks for the comment. Another on the phone? Okay, sure.
Helen, we'll go to the next question, please.
Hi, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Deb Emerson from Sonoma Clean Power. I have two questions. The first is, when you say hourly RA import showing, I want to make sure that means that that's actually been dispatched. Is that correct?
No. So those the blue bar here on slide 80 is how much we've actually seen in the RA showings. So that does not include what was actually dispatched. That would be a different number. That would be a smaller number.
Smaller. So what was so what was actually dispatched by the CAISO and needed would be even less than 10%.
That's right, but sorry. So if we were looking at a lower number that was actually awarded in the day ahead and then awarded in the hourly ahead market, then we would actually be seeing a higher percentage of actual non-delivery according to that ratio. But either way, the intent here on this slide is simply to show that the magnitude that we believe, should be available to the ISO, and then what portion of that didn't actually even deliver. We could enhance this analysis by showing that additional, amount that was actually cleared in the hour ahead as another portion of it, and some additional figures, I think.
Yeah, I would like to see that. And then secondly, could you tell us how this compares to in-state resources as far as what is dispatched and what's not delivered?
I can't opine on that right now. I don't have the figures in front of me, but that's something we could think about as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Eric?
Yeah, Eric from Edison. A couple of things. One, I think a lot of the clarification that the market has received recently and the ISO's desire to put into their tariff the clarification that an import is supposed to be a firm energy import is taking care of a lot of this issue, and I do appreciate the information that you put up here. I would ask, with the clarification that you've given today, that this represents the maximum hour for a given month, that you take a look at kind of the maximum need for the ISO to actually bring in that import. So I could very well see a situation, particularly in March, where prices in the ISO are very, very low, and an importer says, well, I can source that much, much cheaper from a resource already in the ISO, then bring in the import, and I've got a firm energy deal. I delivered on my firm energy. It wasn't causing any stress and strain on the system quite clearly because of prices, and you could very well see that type of result. So I'd like to see this type of graphic for kind of more of a heavy hour than a light hour.
Eric, this is Carl from the ISO. Quick question on that. If they've done that agreement to provide that firm energy from an internal resource, that's happening bilaterally?
The bilaterally,
I guess what I'm getting at, long and short, is how would we track what you're asking?
Well, and so sorry to jump in too as well. This is Chris. So I would go back to this bullet here on speculative supply because we simply don't know if it's energy swapping, if it's just a simple economic energy swap in that situation. There is not enough data in anything that we have to know. All we see is the day-ahead bids. We don't know for sure that they're, purposely being speculative, or if they're actually just saying, hey, I don't want to run that more expensive import. I want to buy something from internal to the ISO and have an economic energy swap, which should be allowed, and I think the ISO is okay with those kind of things, but it would be very difficult for us to actually quantify that. We can't parse out those differences between the bids that are speculative and the ones that are just for energy swapping.
Right. Okay, understood. I guess what I'm asking for is in this graph, rather than simply take the hour of the month that had the most non-delivery, take an hour of the month in which the ISO saw its peak load need. What does that number look like in that circumstance? What type of RA resources from imports did you have available, and what was the amount of them that did not deliver? It's going to be an amount lower than that number because you've already said that's the peak for the month. So at the most, it's going to be equal to that number, but it's probably going to be below it. So that gets you around okay, in this particular hour, somebody had a deal that said, I've got firm energy to be delivered at this intertie point. Was that being brought in from an import, or were they simply substituting something within the area because it was actually cheaper than what they were bringing in? And if it was cheaper, then arguably the ISO wasn't having a reliability problem at that moment. So I would like for us to look at this in a few different manners, but I do appreciate the information. The second issue that I had that I wanted to bring up is I need to understand more about the double counting issue because it's not clear to me what double counting you're seeing. In EIM space, I thought that it was a daily test that looked at whether or not there was any leaning from any EIM entity on another EIM entity. In doing so, I thought what used was their day-ahead schedule, whatever they call it, their baseline information. That baseline information ought to be able to have at that point in time somebody who is already committed in the day ahead to provide an RA import to the ISO. So that day-ahead assessment should already include exactly what that balancing authority is going to have in terms of load, generation, imports, and exports. If they've already got that set of information, there isn't a double counting going on. You know what balancing authorities are doing what. So it's not clear to me where the double counting issue is coming up, so I'd appreciate a bit more on that. I do understand that becomes more of an issue if you move to a day-ahead market for EIM, but we're not there yet, so I'm just trying to solve the immediate problem.
This is Carl from the ISO. Even in EIM, there is still a double counting question that we still need to answer. We'll talk a bit more about it in a little bit with the flexibility component as well. But remember, we do have the sufficiency tests. And so if we're expecting capacity to be coming in, RA capacity to be coming in from the import into the ISO, we need to make sure those sufficiency tests are also accurately accounting for it. And if we're getting that capacity through that energy swap, again, as Chris has said, we can't track that, but we want to make sure that the sufficiency tests for EIM are not counting that import both as RA that's coming in that we think we have in EIM space, as well as something that exists in the native BA.
And additionally, there are many areas that aren't in the EIM, and any resources coming from those areas wouldn't be included in that discussion, so there is potential that they could be double counted. I would agree with you that when we go to day-ahead EIM, eventually that would be more of a concern, which is why we're trying to specify the source of all these RA imports in the next part of the proposal that we'll talk about in the next couple slides. And then to go back to your, other points about the, concerns related to some of the, analysis or trying to change the analysis a bit to try to look and provide some more of those other, monthly peak type of look. I think that that's a fair suggestion. I think we can do some additional analysis on that, but I would also state that, even if we do that, there's another concern related to all this. Even if we see that it's not a huge magnitude, the point is that anything that's not showing up that should be showing up for RA has an impact not only on, the ISO's reliability, but also on the bilateral markets that it's, offset the procurement of some of the internal resources that we are, could really need for reliability in the future. And if those don't get RA contract, they might retire or go away. So it's not just only about reliability, it's also about the, bilateral RA market as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think we need to make sure that the imports are providing the reliability that we expect. I'm just glad that we're finally seeing some information that maybe suggests that it's not as big a problem as people had speculated originally. But I guess I still don't understand the sufficiency test. I thought we were accounting for, on one side, load plus export compared to supply plus import. And if we're doing that, then you should already have all of the information that you need to avoid double counting, because anything that's coming through multiple balancing authorities to get to California as an RA resource is going to have to show up in multiple strings as imports and exports, which means it's going to get accounted for throughout the process. So I'm just not understanding why there's a concern.
So the real concern there is that that resource could be relied upon by another balancing area that's outside of the EIM, or outside. It could have been sold to another third-party entity that's not actually indicated in one of those EIM sufficiency tests. If it was in an EIM BA, we would be able to know that it would be included. But I think that's the concern, is every area is not included in our EIM right now. It would be a little bit easier perhaps if everything was in it. But I want to ask Megan to try to clarify as well, because she responds on that question as well.
Yeah, when it comes to the tag, this is Megan with the ISO, it's not necessarily that it's traveling through a BA, but it's identifying specifically where the source BA is, and that's not needed based on how we're working today, but on the concept of having the extended day-ahead market. So for the extended day-ahead market, and we're doing a day-ahead flexible ramping product or a balancing capacity product of some type in order to meet the resource sufficiency test, we need to know the source BA, and that capacity is reserved specifically for that BA, so we can then potentially trade it and make sure it's being used and counted correctly towards the resource sufficiency test.
So this is in anticipation of an extended day-ahead market?
Yes, the source BA requirement addresses the double counting and is also needed for EDM.
Okay, so if we stay with an EIM in which they're only in real time, this is unnecessary?
Perhaps the part about specifying the BA source, but that doesn't mean that there's not a double counting concern or speculative supply concern, though. So all of these things are needed. I think all the parts of the proposal are certainly necessary. Some of them for other reasons, for more extended EIM reasons. But the ideas that were put in place, to try to accomplish this here on the second bullet about the, adopting some of the current PUC rules into the, CAISO tariff, that certainly is intended to address the double counting and speculative supply issues.
So the speculative piece I certainly understand, and if you go through and make people verify that they actually have a contract, they actually have a firm energy deal that's going to be imported at a specific intertie point, I'm not sure what balancing authority it comes from really makes a difference under the current EIM. You know that it's not speculative because you've seen the contract. You know that it's going to be imported because it's a firm energy deal.
We're saying that for the extended EIM piece, we need the VA sourcing.
I understand, and that's why I'm saying I'm trying to solve one problem at a time. We don't actually have a complete extended day-ahead market at this point. We really haven't even gotten through stakeholder process on it. So I'm not inclined to try to solve RA problems for a market that doesn't exist yet.
Okay, but at the very least, would it be onerous to have them specify the BA source for future needs? I don't think that we would agree with that. It's too onerous to propose this right now.
It limits optionality, so it drives prices. So absolutely, because if I've got a deal right now to bring in an import at, say, Palo Verde, and that can be sourced from any balancing authority that my counterparty wants to, but it's a firm energy deal. If they've got a resource and it goes on outage, they can now pick any other resource in WEC to be able to get that energy to that particular scheduling point. If we say that I have to specify the original balancing authority, then they've only got the limitation of any resource within that area, so it doesn't limit their ability to substitute.
Sorry, we're not making that requirement. We're saying when you do the showing, we need to know what BA source it comes from. If you want to do a substitution for that resource because one went on outage, we're not saying that you're precluded from a different BA source as long as you told us where it was coming from. And I think that this is not an overly onerous type of proposal to make at this time. And, we are trying to ensure reliability here. I think that this part of the proposal has actually been, condensed down to something that is less aggressive than what we were initially asking for, where we were saying we wanted to have resource-specific only. So I think we have tried to make a balance here and understanding on, your viewpoints and others on the other side of discussions, viewpoints as well, Eric.
All right, we'll think about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So this is Carl. I just want to kind of close that conversation real quickly with Eric. There are questions when we're running the sufficiency test that again, we're still trying to burrow down into and make sure that when we do the accounting, we're doing it correctly, which is to say, if a BAA passes a sufficiency test but is doing so because they're relying on capacity that's already committed to the ISO, is that okay? Or if we fail the sufficiency test in the ISO because we didn't account for capacity in another BA that had been committed to the ISO, is that okay? So we haven't run to ground all of the ways that we need to account for this. It's clear that the need is there for the day ahead for EDAM, and so you're concerned about trying to solve all of the world's problems in one proceeding. We get it. But we want to make sure also that even with the markets we do have, specifically the energy imbalance market, that all of the capacity is credited to the BAA that is relying on it, and we're not allowing them to take advantage of capacity that has been committed to the ISO for sufficiency purposes. So with that, I'm going to kind of let Chris move on to the callers on the phone.
Okay, go ahead, operator. Please open the line.
Okay, the line is open.
Hi there, it's Jeff Spires from PowerX again. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on the discussion. First of all, I disagree that the need to identify the source BA is related specifically to EDAM or some other market. I think just in the context of resource adequacy, identifying the source BA, as I think Chris pointed out, is in our view the bare minimum, because really what we're talking about here is securing forward capacity from actual resources. And so providing some of the most basic information about where is that resource located seems like the very simplest step we could take to ensure that when capacity is being sold on the interties, that it's actually backed up with something real, which is tell us where it's located, tell us what BA it's in. I don't think that that's linked to an EDAM. I think that that's critical to avoiding these significant concerns we've been talking about, whether it's speculative supply or double counting or some variation on those issues. In the context of EIM, I think the data sharing associated with EIM is a good opportunity to be able to allow the CAISO to verify the resources that are supplying capacity to make sure that they actually truly are available. But as others have pointed out, I just want to elaborate on this. RA contracts are sold by entities that are in the EIM and outside of the EIM. And so just focusing on EIM data sharing is not enough. It might be worth the CAISO considering whether data sharing for entities that are outside of the EIM is also something that should be pursued to make sure that they've got the appropriate information to be able to verify that the supply is available. The other point on the EIM data sharing that I sort of lost my train of thought on the second point, but I think that was pretty much what I wanted to point out, was that the EIM is really only a subset. And the other assumption I think we're all making is if you're using the EIM for data sharing, it assumes that you know which BA that capacity is coming from. So again, I'm not sure how we can even proceed with appropriate data sharing inside the EIM if we don't know which BA is that RA capacity intended to be coming from. So I really do think that that's the critical first step here, and I don't think that that's necessarily just EDAM specific. I think that's something that needs to be addressed now.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for your support. And, you know, I do think that you are correct in stating that it's not simply just for the EIM, but, you know, again, we're going to go over the next couple slides here. It does, you know, use that as part of our justification when we have that extended EIM, but I think it will help to ensure that there is really, truly, you know, physical resources backing the supply in combination with the, you know, adoption of some of the current PUC provisions. Also, you know, I would note the PUC just opened another proceeding related to the RA imports as well that we will be participating in, and that perhaps could help inform these discussions and maybe adjust our proposal down the line as well. So thanks for that support. I'm going to go here to the room. Mark, please.
It's Mark Smith with Calpine. This is a clarification, I think, of this slide. So in the showing, you identify the source VA. But you're not requiring that tags to fulfill the obligation and deliveries come from that same source BA. Is that correct?
No, that's not included in the proposal this time.
Okay. So if I, for instance, point to my generating plant, Hermiston, which is in its own gen-only BA, I can point to that to meet a monthly RA showing obligation, but there are times when that plant simply is uneconomic to run. I can deliver from any BA as long as I deliver to the intertie point that I have identified.
So yeah, I think under the current process that would be allowed. We have contemplated creating different tagging requirements. We thought about, you know, requiring a day-ahead tagging requirement or a month-ahead tagging requirement or something like that, where, you know, that could address, you know, that issue and perhaps put a different onus on delivering from the specific resource or a specific BA at least. But we haven't gone forth with that part of the proposal at this time, but I think we're, you know, reserving judgment on that, and we might need to include that in future proposals.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think Dr. Harvey from the MSC identified that even if you do identify the source BA, that you should allow replacement when it's economically advantageous to substitute or replace with some other resource or some other purchase. That does make sense. But absent having a specific resource identified, I don't know what advantage there is to identifying a source BA. The BA obviously has no obligation whatsoever to deliver energy across the commercial terms that you've established. And does it really identify the location of the generator? You know, if you source from BPA, does that really help you know where the location of the generator is or whether there's transmission to get all the way to your intertie point? I think that might be a necessary but not sufficient set of conditions to ensure that imports are going to be reliable. We'll put that in comments, though. Thanks.
Thanks for your feedback, Mark. You know, I think we understand those kind of, you know, concerns or feedback on that, but again, on slide 82 here, you know, one of the major reasons we're proposing this is for the extended EIM sufficiency testing. We think it is necessary to have that at a minimum, and you know, we feel pretty strongly about that. So perhaps there are, you know, some other, you know, clarifications or details we could include, you know, related to tagging and other things. But, you know, at this point, you know, to your question about the tagging or the, you know, the transmission availability, I think, you know, CAISO is primarily concerned with ensuring that they're delivered to the actual, you know, intertie point that they've been shown for. So at this point, that's really our proposal. But, you know, we welcome the feedback for sure. So, again, let's keep trying to move through these slides here because we're still behind schedule. But, you know, I think on this one, I think we've kind of beat this dead horse pretty much to a pulp here on the EIM. Need for having a specific BA source required. So I'm going to keep moving forward to some of the other items. So the big thing we changed in the proposal this time is simply to say we're going to incorporate the PUC's RA program rules for imports into the CAISO tariff so that it applies to all LSEs, not just the PUC's LSEs. I think that should hopefully address some of our concerns related to double counting, related to, these non-resource specific imports actually having firm energy delivery. So the idea here is really that, the CPUC has said you have to have a, firm energy delivery that's for a monthly basis and operating reserves behind that to count and qualify to meet RA with an unspecified RA import. So, they also require that they have to have contract language or an attestation from some kind of import provider that would confirm that that really is truly the case, and there isn't a situation where it's not really going to be reliable. So we think that this is a kind of a balancing act between both bookends of where we were initially looking at going with the proposal. We think it is appropriate to incorporate this into our tariff. So again, so it applies to all LSEs, and then we would just require a similar amount of documentation be provided to the ISO. Okay, so any questions about that? And again, as I mentioned earlier, I guess I would note again that, the PUC has just opened one of their rulemakings on imports as well. So we're going to be, if you want to jump in on that as well, Jamie. It's not working. Somebody else mind handing her a mic? There we go.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. It's not a rulemaking. We just issued a ruling.
Oh, a ruling. Sorry.
Yeah, a ruling in the current rulemaking on imports, and asked parties to respond to some questions in the ruling.
And then you guys might consider doing additional changes to your regulations through that ruling, and any of the feedback you get. Or is there any intended
if there's more clarification that needs to be made.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So so we look forward to participating in that process and commenting on that ruling. But thanks for the clarity there. Sorry, it's not a rulemaking; it's a ruling that they just put out. And I think that seeking additional information related to these issues, and we also just want to express our thanks and support for the PUC's recent clarifications on these import issues. With their LSEs and making sure that we do have really, truly reliable imports. So thanks to the PUC for that work. Okay, any questions on this part of the proposal? One on the phone.
Helen, we'll go to the question on the phone.
Certainly, caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Chris. Jeff Spires from PowerX. I think we support that the CAISO clarifying tariff language in a manner that's similar to some of the steps CPUC has recently taken. I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts to some of that. With respect to clarifying firm energy with sufficient operating reserves, I just wanted to highlight that in our view that goes beyond the traditional spinning and non-spinning contingency reserves. Of course, those are extremely important, and they ensure that there's capacity to respond to predetermined qualifying events like a unit loss. But we think that it's also important to clarify that there's a need for something that we generally refer to as balancing reserves, which is basically the balancing capacity in the source BA to make sure that BA can sustain the export to the CAISO for the full period of its obligation. And so an example would be if you had an external BA with a wind resource that was exporting its energy, does it have sufficient balancing reserves from a flexible resource to make sure that if the wind falls off, it can deploy those resources and continue to deliver on that export rather than cut the schedule? So we think when we're talking about firm energy, it's not just about contingency reserves. That concept of having enough operating reserves in a general sense should include the ability to sustain output and ensure that you've got enough balancing reserve to maintain that schedule for the duration of its obligation. The other point I just wanted to quickly make that I don't think is talked about in the slides is just on the firm transmission. We think it's really important to have firm transmission, and the current tariff language we think is somewhat outdated because in the context of the open access transmission framework outside of the CAISO, you can end up with a situation where a transmission path is sold multiple times. It can be sold as a firm, generally longer-term product to one entity, and then it could be sold on a shorter-term basis to other entities. And the problem with that is that the entities that are relying on non-firm transmission are able to use that transmission only to the extent that the firm rights holder isn't using it. And so what that non-firm transmission is exposed to is being bumped anytime that the firm rights holder chooses to use that transmission, and that can be including using that path to deliver to other BAs other than the CAISO. So there's no guarantee that a firm rights holder that bumps an entity that's delivering an RA product to the CAISO, that doesn't necessarily mean that the firm rights holder is delivering energy to the CAISO as well. They could be using that path to go elsewhere. So I think that's an important consideration on the transmission firmness to ensure that you're actually able to rely on that delivery. The other point I would just add on the transmission is we have moved now over time into a shorter and shorter term scheduling, including intra-hour 15-minute scheduling. So the ability to assume that transmission is going to be available for the hour is no longer a safe assumption, because firm rights holders can now schedule on that transmission on a shorter term basis even in the hour, and so those non-firm rights holders are actually subject to curtailment within the hour based on the 15-minute scheduling practices outside of the CAISO. So I just wanted to emphasize that we were supportive of the direction you're taking here, but I think the concept of sufficient balancing reserves as well as firm transmission are both important. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so I'm hearing, from you that some feedback that we should consider incorporating balancing reserves as part of this, and then as well the idea of the firm transmission. I think we do intend that the firm energy delivery concept should incorporate firm transmission service as well. But I think we might need to specify that more clearly and talk about it, the duration of that. Is it a monthly, month ahead type of firm transmission service that, also shown as part of the requirements here? So I think we could clarify a little bit as we, enhance the initiative proposal on this issue. Thanks for the feedback, Jeff. Okay. A couple of things that we're talking about that we wanted to kind of walk back on a little bit here. Not that we're not pursuing some of the prior aspects at this time to allow for us to continue some additional analysis. So at this point in time, we're not going to continue to propose a real-time bidding requirement for all RA import megawatts. So this is something we had included in the prior proposal. The other one is also no longer proposing to require 24/7 RA import must offer obligation. So, there's some discussion in the proposal about why we, think that those aren't appropriate to continue to pursue right at this point. But again, we want to reserve judgment on that and do some more analysis before we, make a final proposal and actually really preclude ourselves from doing any of these concepts. But again, we want to make sure that we balance the need for reliability here with the impacts to, cost and customer, concerns as well. So that's really where we're coming from on these couple items that we're kind of putting on hold for the part of the proposal related to RA import. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E, and I guess I need a little help understanding why the ISO thinks it doesn't need imports to be able to meet its RA requirements or its requirements, reliability requirements in the off-peak periods, and essentially providing a pass for generators or imports essentially to be showing up in that time when it does not make that same requirement for internal resources.
Well, that's the existing status quo right now. We've had that process in place where, a subset of our import contracts can count towards meeting RA and can be shown for, meeting monthly RA requirements. And at this point in time, we're just simply saying we're not proposing to change that.
But I guess that doesn't really answer the question. The question basically is, why does the ISO feel that it needs the internal resources to provide a 24/7 must-offer obligation, but imports not have to do that? I mean, what's so special about imports that they are not needed to make reliability in the off-peak hours? But it is a requirement for essentially internal resources. I'm just looking at treatment here.
Sure.
And so would it be possible essentially to look at only having the same sort of requirement for must offer from internal resources as for imports?
I would say, I think, we heard some of that discussion yesterday. We might need to be open to, creating some kind of new must-offer obligation for imports or for internal resources. But, there's a lot of reasons why imports are different from internal resources. We're trying to, incorporate provisions to make them closer to the same treatment as the internal. So, I think we are open to, enhancements on either side of that to try to, address your concern, though, Peter.
No, it's just the point to some degree is the more you have different types of resources count differently, or at least have obligations that are different, but they count the same, essentially you're changing the nature of the market and you're not making a uniform type of market. And that's just a general concern that I think that we need to keep in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. And, if you do have a specific direction on either of those items that you raised, then, please include those in your feedback, and we'll, take that into account as well. Megan, do you want to make a clarification, and then we'll go to you, Steve?
Yeah, this is Megan with the ISO, and I think one of the major distinctions between the 24/7 real-time move for internal resources in comparison to imports is the transmission piece of this. So if you have an RA showing on an intertie and you do bid into the day-ahead market that the ISO doesn't plan on using, let's say, the full capacity of the Mullen intertie based on all of the mix that was awarded, then we want to free up that transmission, because if that transmission has to be locked in a place and it's firm transmission and it has to be tagged, why would we need to hold that transmission with a real-time MOO if we're not planning on using it? And I think that's the main distinction. If you're not clearing the day-ahead market and you've already met your MOO, then we should allow for that transmission to be freed up into the real-time market, and that creates more flexibility.
That's not addressing the question of why you're requiring internal resources to be available on the hours that the RA is not available for transmission. You're just saying this is why we want to sort of free up the transmission to be able to do that, but you're not saying why does the ISO need the internal resources to be available?
Okay, so this is Carl from the ISO. I just want to kind of, again, in the interest of time and kind of moving on, because we've got a few slides to cover on flexibility before lunch. Peter, I hear your question. You're kind of asking the inverse of what Megan answered, which is to say, cool, you want to let them out of that. Well, why not let the real-time or the internal resources out of it as well? And we heard that question yesterday. We're working on it.
Yeah, and I think, Megan provides a good reasoning for why we, move to this part of the proposal on these two items is really, again, about that efficiency, allowing for the transmission system to be utilized more efficiently, hopefully. So, and balancing the costs and impacts to suppliers, ratepayers, that sort of thing. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, Stephen Kelly with IEP. I think since one of the goals of this program was to try to make comparable treatment across RA resources, it would be helpful, following up on Carl's comment, to make clear why you have exceptions when you do in future documentation.
Thanks for your comment. We will certainly take that under consideration. Okay, we got one more on the phone, then I'll move on.
Okay, caller line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Deb from Sonoma again. I'm glad you're not proposing the real-time bidding requirements. I think, as Megan said, I believe just holding up that transmission for something that could possibly only be dispatched for 15 minutes is very cost prohibitive, and it could stop with the amount of import RA that you receive. And then I think if you look at the NERC standards for establishing a BA, that you will find the various requirements for reserves in that. And I would encourage the CAISO, instead of making additional requirements, working with the NERC standards to make sure that those satisfy what you're actually looking for. And then lastly, if you do decide to impose only firm transmission being used, which I would recommend against that, given that we would be leaving a lot of transmission on the system, please look into potentially opening up market power, because there are very few entities that hold up most of that firm transmission. Thanks.
Thanks for your comments. Okay. I'm going to move on to the MIC component. Hopefully we can finish this off very quickly and then move on to flex before lunchtime. So a couple of things on the maximum import capability provisions. We have been looking at the calculation of how we actually determine the full amount of MIC that we allocate. We do believe that that is continuing to be appropriate with the historical approach that we utilize today. Maintaining that, we believe, does not represent any kind of concern. We didn't get a lot of feedback from stakeholders saying otherwise, so we're continuing on that aspect of the proposal. The other aspect of the proposal that we are going to propose modifications for is the allocation process. So again, a little bit of background. There's a 13-step allocation process where we provide LSEs opportunity to get a share of that MIC on the various interties. That is the aspect that we're trying to propose, because we did receive a lot of feedback about that being problematic or having some concerns from stakeholders. So a little bit more on the background. We've gone over this a few times, so I'm just going to throw it up here and try to go through it pretty quickly. But again, after we calculate the total amount of MIC, then we protect for the ETCs, TORs, and other PRA commitments. That determines how much is remaining for allocation under the available import capability allocation process. It's in detail in the appendix with some of the steps in the proposal and under our tariff as well on that section up here on the slide. This slide is just simply, again, we've showed this before, but this is just a description of all the steps of the existing process. You know, some folks think it's a bit onerous, and we're seeking some changes to it. So we did review that stakeholder feedback, and we think that it is appropriate to propose some modifications at this point. Some of the reasons that folks stated they wanted us to make changes were related to, you know, fairness and efficiency, as well as ease of implementation and understanding of the process as well. So one of the things that folks mentioned is that some of the LSCs might not utilize all of their allocated MIC during all the RA months, and so they also might not be making that available for others to buy. There's reasons for that we understand, you know, for substitution and rain, you know, risk avoidance, those sort of things. But we do want to try to address some of these concerns related to that. The other concern is that some of the smaller LSCs have expressed that they are worried about the ability to secure enough MIC on a desired intertie to support their RA procurement. So we're trying to balance these, you know, issues related to fairness, efficiency, and kind of the implementation of this whole process in the changes that we're proposing to make. So a big piece here that we're proposing, we talked about a few different options in the prior proposals, and we said we were going to put out an initial, proposal for this in our revised straw, and what we're going to propose is incorporating an auction mechanism into the process to try to address some of these concerns. So change the whole allocation process to simply more of an auction mechanism. We think that this will provide an alternative or other opportunity for procurement of import capability by various LSCs. Should allow for some LSCs that want to get more than their pro rata load share to get that, hopefully. And we think that will allow for more efficient procurement of the capability that utilized, for RA purposes in a way that doesn't, kind of strand some of that or withhold some of that from being utilized. So hopefully this should be a good change, but again, the details are really what matters. So this is an initial proposal. We're open to, modifications to enhance the proposal and provide the details that are necessary to implement this. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric Medicine, what would happen to auction revenues, and would the ISO have any form of a reservation price for any auctions?
Good questions. So we are going to go over that in a couple of slides here. So you'll get an answer to that. So next slide here, the initial auction design concept is just being presented again for discussion purposes. Obviously, some of those things like the reservation price, bids and offers, what kind of things we would need to do to actually implement this. We need to, work out and iron out those details for our next proposals. But again, the idea, we think that this could address some of the fairness issues, and the idea here is that we would incorporate it after step 4. So we would still do the calculation, then we would protect for all the existing transmission contracts and pre-RA commitments and TOR rights as we do today. And then following that, it basically would replace the current process, which is going back to this slide, where we go and basically allocate all that remaining import capability starting at step 5 through 13. We would just replace that with an auction mechanism. So that's the idea here. We would also, want to address some of these issues. So the idea, again, is, it would allow LSEs to bid for the import capability on a specific intertie that they value. The capability allocated according to the bids, 100% of that would be allocated out based on bids to buy, with each intertie becoming a specific product. And then, you could trade those things later as needed bilaterally. We would continue to have that, but then here, the last bullet, a sub-bullet here, the auction revenues piece to your question before, Eric, we're not proposing a specific way of allocating it back, but the two ideas that we're putting out there for feedback are either use it to reduce the TAC transmission revenue requirement or just allocate it back to all LSEs on a pro rata load ratio share basis. So basically, we're trying to think about ways to avoid impacts to the efficiency of an auction design. So that is important to us. We want to make sure that anything that we determine is actually, fair and appropriate method of allocating that. And we do have that principle that, LSEs have paid for the transmission system, so they deserve to get the rights. But we also have to balance that with the, issues related to the current process that have been raised and then some of the concerns that we want to try to address as well. Go ahead, Aaron.
Are the only bidders that are allowed LSEs?
So initially, that's what we're proposing. I think we considered, should we let or allow for other entities to do that? I think at this point, we don't believe that that's appropriate at this time. I think folks could perhaps continue to do, bilateral trading after the auction, and other entities like, suppliers or other financial interests might want to buy some of the MIC or something from LSEs. But at this point, we're proposing that just the LSEs would be able to bid in this auction for the MIC.
Thank you.
All right. So some of the other things that we wanted to talk about, we previously had got some feedback from folks that there should be this idea of forcing the release of unused RA MIC, that wasn't shown on the RA contract, or sorry, an RA showing to support the contract. And really the problem with doing that is, one, there's a lot of reasons for people holding on to the MIC currently. If they've been allocated that MIC, they might want to avoid substitution or RAIN impacts. So there's some risk aversion, I think, perhaps drives some of this behavior. It's really not a liquid market that has a lot of activity going on. We don't see a lot of bilateral trading already. So the big reason why we don't want to try to incorporate a release, use it or lose it kind of type of approach here on this is because it doesn't really work within the monthly showing process right now because of the time frame. So, even if we wanted to try to say release it, then, we'd have to go through another additional process of waiting for people to procure that and then re-show, that sort of thing. So we could potentially fit it in, perhaps, but we're making a lot of changes to the time frames here. So that's one of the reasons why we're holding off on doing that. We think that the auction mechanism that we're intending and proposing here should address some of these concerns without having to go to some of these other drastic measures. And then lastly, the other one that we looked at that folks mentioned was, hey, if you guys don't do an auction, come up with some other kind of better bulletin board or some other way of reassigning or trading for the MIC. And so, that basically we're thinking the auction mechanism should address this kind of an issue, and we would still allow for bilateral trading after the fact, but at this point we're not really proposing to create another like bulletin board or other type of mechanism beyond what we currently have, where we allow for, folks to just identify and give us a trade, and then, allocate that MIC to the other entity that's purchased it. So that's it on the MIC piece. Obviously, more details to come on the auction mechanism that we're, proposing, and going to refine that and take some feedback from stakeholders that we get in the written comments and provide some additional clarity on the auction design. So any feedback you guys have on that would be welcomed. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up unless there's any final questions on MIC. One on the phone. Okay, let's go to the phone, please.
Hi, Chris. It's Jeff Spires. This is an area that this topic is one that we've raised in the past, and we support the CAISO trying to find ways to improve the MIC allocation. I think some of the other changes that you're proposing, like the UCAP, are also going to be helpful from the perspective of hopefully reducing the need or the incentive to hold on to MIC at the last minute for substitution or for other things. So that's probably a positive impact there. And I think the concept of an auction is an interesting one that we would like to contemplate further. I think, from our perspective, we just need to find a way to make sure that MIC is being made available to those that are seeking to procure external resources, and that it shouldn't end up being stranded or otherwise blocking those transactions. And if the ties really aren't being fully utilized for RA contracts, then we need to make sure that MIC is being made available to entities that are looking for it. So it shouldn't really, in our view, have a high cost if it's not getting fully used. So I think we just need to think about the right mechanics to make sure that the entities that actually are seeking to do these transactions have an opportunity to get the MIC and make sure that it's really facilitating these different contracts. I think really just at a higher level, there's external supply out there that is available for RA, and we've seen in the past that the MIC allocation is one of the impediments to those transactions occurring. And I think, the other topic just more generally is, and we know that this is something that the CAISO and the CPUC would need to consider, but just the whole concept of having a monthly showing in the first place adds a lot of the complexity associated with the planned outages, substitution, the MIC allocation. And so, obviously that's something for CPUC and for CAISO to discuss, but in our view, it's worth considering, is the monthly showing really the right thing to be doing, or would it be better to be trying to meet these needs on an annual or seasonal basis? Because not only do you have the complexity that could be getting in the way of some of these transactions occurring, but we're also just seeing that as the grid's getting tighter, there are other purchasers outside of the CAISO that are willing to enter into longer-term contracts, whether it's a year ahead or a season ahead or even multiple year contracts. And so, are you putting yourself at a disadvantage by waiting until the month before without having, and basically allowing the longer-term contracts to take place and then just seeing what's left over, when there could be more cost-effective means if you were able to shift that up in a manner that's more similar to the way that other entities outside of the CAISO are willing to contract. So, I know that's a different topic than MIC specifically, but just one that I think is worth considering as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, there's a good point to note some of the other impacts from the UCAP proposal, at the beginning of your comment. I think that is accurate, and I didn't mention that, but that is something that we think will help with some of this, incentive that folks have to kind of hold on to MIC and maybe not utilize it. So that's an important concept to note as well. So we think perhaps with the combination of that UCAP proposal and then this auction design, we should address a lot of the concerns. On the, month ahead showing thing, I think that is, a large discussion. I'm going to withhold judgment on it at this point, but an interesting concept to think about. Go ahead, Vic.
Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas Electric. Does this have any impact on CRRs, or does this necessitate any further changes in the CRR paradigm, or are they completely isolated so that it should not have a problem?
Yeah, MIC is not the same thing as the, transmission rights. Those CRR allocations, are based off congestion. MIC is simply a capacity deliverability type of a concept, so it doesn't have anything to do with, the actual real-time transmission capability concept that would, I think, overlap with some of that CRR aspect. So I don't believe at this time we've identified that there would be any issues or impact to the CRR market or auction process or anything like that at that point. But if folks do have thoughts on that or think that there is some impact or, touch points there, let us know.
Yeah, I just wondering for long-term CRRs when they're from a source outside the Cal ISO and stuff like that, what the interactions would be.
It's a good question. Let us think about that a little bit more. Thanks, Vic. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl. So everyone get ready for the fun flex. All right.
Woo! Go get them.
Yay. So there's a lot to cover here this morning, obviously. I'm going to do my best to try and expedite the discussion, so bear with me. I've been going through my slide deck to try and figure out if there's pieces we can move past, but I want to make sure that we have time through the entirety of the day to cover everything. So we'll get through as much as we can before lunch, and then we'll make a determination on whether or not you get lunch. And I think we're going to be here until 4, but that's just where we're at now. So we're going to start talking about flexible RA, and we have a lot of background that we've already gone through in the discussions from FRACMU 2, as well as the original FRACMU discussions. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to note on these. We are closing FRACMU 2. It's done. Okay. We're moving it into this initiative where we're going to continue taking on flexible RA as a product, but hopefully, if I get my way, we will never have to say FRACMU again. It just gets old after like 5 years. So from a flexibility standpoint, one of the things we've heard is questions about what is driving the ISO's need, what are we trying to solve, and so we really sat down and we said, let's look at all of the reasons why we need flexible capacity, meaning anything that's causing us to move things around, basically, on our system. And we've come up with a fairly broad list, and we understand that items like forecast error, timing granularity deviation, not everything that we identified is something that we look at and say, wow, we really need an RA product and forward procurement to address that. Some of these items actually resolve through other manners. But as we looked through these needs, basically we broke them down into 3 different categories. We broke them down into primary, secondary, and tertiary flexibility needs. Now, primary we broke down as frequency response, and the question of do we need that as an RA product for forward procurement? Our initial assessment was no. This is an obligation interconnection to be able to provide or to get the frequency response we need. And if we're not getting that, the capability, because the incentives are wrong, that's one thing, but we know the capabilities are there. And so if there's additional need for frequency response, the ISO can, when it has identified a need to take further action, look to incentivize greater provision of that frequency response. Right now, we're not seeing it. We're doing all right, so we've not initiated that stakeholder process, but we can if we need to. The secondary piece of this is, again, responding to some of those still very short-term but real-time operational needs that we have regulation for. When we looked at this and said, do we need RA procurement for regulation? The answer, again, was no. We have a fair amount of regulation on our system today. We have a day-ahead market where we're buying much of the regulation we need and rebalancing as we need to through real time. So we, again, for regulation purposes, we didn't see a need to kind of put that into and plan an RA product to facilitate that. However, when we looked at our tertiary flexibility needs, these are the ones that are based on market optimization and balancing. And we did see some benefits to having an RA requirement for this, making sure that we have sufficient economic bid range to balance the variability we see, but not only that, the invariability, trying to have the resources that can move around, some resources that may not be dispatchable, that they're coming on and we're getting their full output, and we need to have resources that can move around them. We want to make sure that, as we talked a little bit earlier, when we're looking at our EIM sufficiency tests, particularly in this instance, making sure that we have sufficient ramping capability to meet those sufficiency tests. If we're going to go through all this hassle to build this really cool EIM thing and even EDAM thing, we should probably have the resources that we need through RA at a minimum to make sure that we're able to take advantage of that. So having the resources to say, if there's BAAs that are not passing those sufficiency tests, it will not be California because the RA program's already addressing that. And then again, trying to make sure that the resources that are flexible and able to move around, for variability and the invariability, have a path to sustained revenues to make sure they maintain economic viability over time. So again, trying to put a more explicit value or need out there for both planning purposes, and then as that moves into the real-time operational needs, that we have the right resources available to us. So long and short is that we'll be, as we go forward on this process, we will be looking to focus on the tertiary needs, not the secondary needs, or primary or secondary needs. So that's our goal here. So again, trying to make sure that we're able to realize the full EIM benefits, and that we have, again, this has long been a goal that we've worked back and forth with many stakeholders here as well as parties in the CPUC to make sure that the processes and procurement facilitate good economic retirement, meaning the policy objectives that we have moving forward are recognized through market signals and pricing, and that we're able to achieve those objectives. So this is getting back a little bit to some of the FRAC Move 2 discussion, which is what are the operational needs the ISO is specifically looking to address. And we broke these down, just as we did in FRAC Move 2, into two types of needs, the predictable and the unpredictable, the known and the unknown, or whatever that is. Basically looking at the idea of, yes, we know that we know when the sun rises, we know when the sun sets, but that doesn't mean it doesn't create some operational challenges in trying to have a fleet of resources to dispatch around those large ramps, and trying to plan for that has significant benefits in being able to, again, maintain targets for state environmental policy, as well as the ISO maintaining reliable operation. And then, the other thing that we also know is that with forecasts, they are inevitably wrong. We're still pretty good at it, but they're wrong. And so what we need is to have, again, some resources that are capable of providing fast ramping capabilities in real time, such that we can make sure that when we have errors in those forecasts, we have resources that can be dispatched or recommitted at different levels to account for that uncertainty. So I'm going to note here the ISOs. We've currently got the flexible capacity requirement set based on a 3-hour net load ramp, and I'm sure most of you here in the room and on the phone have followed our flexible RA needs assessments on an annual basis, and has continued to see the 3-hour net load ramp grow. And what we're also seeing is the steepest portion of that 3-hour net load ramp is also growing. So we're looking at this as a single 1-hour block about what is the fastest hour within that nonlinear 3-hour ramp curve that is how fast is that growing? We're seeing it start to exceed 50% of that 3-hour net load ramp. It's showing that the average ramp rate that we need during that interval is much higher than even the other 2 hours in that ramping interval. And so trying to make sure that we have resources to, again, accommodate those 1 hour net load ramps. So one of the changes that we're seeing as we move to a little bit more of a decentralized system, more distributed energy resources, is that we're having a lot more, and variable energy resources, we're having a lot more uncertainty between our day-ahead and real-time markets. And so making sure that we have resources that can be picked up or in that real-time time frame is becoming more and more important, because once we pass our RUC horizon, picking up resources that are not short start resources for commitment purposes is no longer feasible. For our stuck process to pick them up, I believe the requirement is they must be able to cycle within the stuck horizon, and that's right now a 4.5 hour horizon. So we want to make sure that we have sufficient fast ramping and even committable resources between the IFM and FMM. Now we note this with the alignment of what we're trying to do in the day-ahead market enhancement stakeholder initiative, where we're still working on developing an imbalanced reserve product that is really designed to try and help our IFM process to make sure that we have sufficient headroom and drop capacity, ability to lower output to deal with uncertainty ranges. So we recognize that that's going to be an element of our market moving forward. Again, it's still under development right now, but we are coordinating our efforts on this front so that we make sure that whatever's being procured through flexible RA is also having benefits and able to be utilized in trying to help manage some of the uncertainty that imbalanced reserves is looking to meet. So when we're trying to define the new flexible RA categories, and quite frankly, that's what we are trying to do here today, we've tried to create some basic objectives that we want to meet. Now, there are some things that the current flexible RA product does well, and there's certain things that it does, well, not so well. So we wanted to focus on the things that it did well and maintain some of those, which is to say, whether you agree with the product as it is today, it is clearly stated, quantified, flexible capacity needs. We know how much is needed, and we know how resources count towards meeting that. We want to make sure the resources are procured and made available to the ISO. We don't want to simply say, hey, we think we'll have enough, and go into real time, or even the IFM and say, we think we'll have enough flexible RA. We want to make sure that this is something that we're planning for. We also are running a market here. Markets are best solved using economic solutions and economic bids, not penalty parameters. So again, part of what we're looking for here is we want to make sure that we're maintaining good depth of economic bids. So we want the market to be nice and liquid, and trying to the extent possible have more economic bids and not really rely on self-scheduling. We understand that's part of the market. It is what it is. But to the extent that we can have the economic bids, that leads to better market signals about the value of the energy we need. We want to make sure that the resources are compensated for the attributes they provide. So again, trying to identify what the needs are and what it is we're specifically driving at. What we did in the first slide I showed in identifying the primary, secondary, and tertiary product or flexibility needs, and eliminating the primary and secondary, our hope is that allows us to focus on the attributes of need. Are we trying to value regulation or frequency response in this discussion? No, we are not. So when we get to some of the proposal about what resources count or how we're talking about resources, trying to clarify that those are not problems that we are trying to solve in this. And then again, as I've mentioned, we want to make sure that we're passing our portion of the EIM sufficiency test. So here it is. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at three requirements that we're talking about one, to meet the uncertainty, and you can see that on this slide in the little blue segments around our load ramps. We're looking for what we're calling fast ramp. I know some would argue that's not really fast ramp, but it is relative to what we have today, and that's really focused on having capacity that can ramp over a single hour, and having that requirement set at the largest single 3-hour net load ramp, or largest 1-hour net load ramp. I'm going to screw that up more than once today. And then finally having the long ramp, which quite frankly is very much similar to what we have today, which is to say there's still an interest and need in addressing that 3-hour net load ramp. So these are the 3 requirements that the ISO is looking to establish, and I think this is a good time to kind of pause, because I realize over the past 10 minutes I've been absolutely flying, but I don't think we've missed substance. We can go back. This is, I think, where the real conversation starts. So I'm going to pause for questions now. Peter?
Yeah, this is Peter Griffiths, PG&E, and I guess and I understand where you're going. I understand the history, and I don't want to throw you off of sort of the conversation and the track you want to go down. But I do want to sort of introduce the question of, at some point you're going to have to, in this type of framework, you're going to have to answer the question, what happens to the wind and solar resources in terms of how they can count for flexibility in what they're doing.
Absolutely.
But I just sort of point out, if you go way back to the beginning, the whole concept of net load ramp is you're assuming there must take.
So we've got solutions here that
I don't want to belabor, but for the most part, the whole idea of having certain types of resources as must take, and basically doing all of the planning and all of the liability around making those resources must take, I'm not sure what that has to do with reliability. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have on your list of objectives is to meet state policy goals, but I'm not quite sure at what point meeting that state policy goals, how far you have to essentially define what the rules are and treat things differently to be able to make that be the case.
Yeah.
And so I just want to point out, has the ISO just asked the question, and you don't have to answer it, but has the ISO thought about trying to essentially eliminate the whole concept of net load and essentially require things instead of essentially having them be must take, have a must offer obligation for wind and solar, and to the extent they can be dispatchable, be dispatchable.
Okay, so we will get to some what I think are very interesting and neat new solutions. Some of it will pull in pieces from the other now closed initiative that shall no longer be named, that really look at wind and solar differently, particularly solar and what we get from solar in terms of particularly the net load ramps. Have we thought about getting rid of net load? No, because it's something we have to deal with. Are we thinking about them all as must take? No, not anymore. And I think that's some of the big changes we're going to have through our proposal and how we basically build up to looking at the requirement and then looking at how resources can address it.
Yeah, I just note that the reliability requirement that you're setting up is based on the assumption that there must take.
And that's going to get to how they can help meet the need. That's how we'll address that. Are there any? Well, of course there are other questions. And Vic had his hand up first. There, could you mic off?
Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas and Electric. I know it's early on in the process here, but I just want to make sure that you take into account what's being done in the day-ahead market enhancements, and it may make perhaps long ramp or something of part of this not necessary that it's covered by some other market product in the future. So I just want to put that out there that we want to have as few market products as possible, and if a different market product is covering that need, that we're not covering it again here.
We agree with that, Vic. I think what we're looking for here is we want synergies between what FlexRA is doing, what day-ahead market enhancements is doing in terms of the imbalance reserves, and so making sure that we have enough flexible capacity for the imbalance reserves. but not trying to have so many capacity products defined as to make it an unprocurable requirement. So we are trying to keep this as narrow as we felt possible. You guys will obviously let us know vocally how well we did on that with loud yays or loud nays, so we'll find out. Eric?
Eric from Edison. So has or will the ISO be providing any information to demonstrate that the current fleet measured under a 3-hour block is insufficient to meet the faster ramp needs?
We provided that information in the other initiative that is now closed. But again, whether or not, excuse me, the existing fleet is adequate under that 3-hour net load ramp definition relies on a couple assumptions that will be changing here. The first assumption is that the net load ramp that we've measured today does not accurately reflect the net load ramp that we're actually trying to manage, which is to say we're relying on PI data to develop the 3-hour net load ramping needs. That does not show us what we did not dispatch, or did not produce, which is to say we have not yet built in all of the curtailments. And again, some of those are economic, some of them are not, making sure those are all built back into it. And so what it means is that the number we're actually seeing is somewhat less than the net load ramp would actually be. But then the other point of this is to say, fine, even if the current fleet is meeting this, that's great, but we also know that we're in a transitionary time frame. The tomorrow fleet is not necessarily assured to do that either, or are we getting the resources with the correct offer obligation and operational attributes to be able to meet this as well. So even though what we've seen to date shows that the constraint may not be binding, the ISO's position is and has always been that that doesn't necessitate, or that doesn't imply that therefore we don't have a need to plan for this. We think that having this in place and planning for this is a superior solution so that when it binds, we've already taken account of that.
I don't mind it being on a planning basis. I just want to see the study results that say that the fleet that we have or the anticipated fleet that we have is insufficient to meet those shorter ramps. The reality is, as we start transitioning, the resources that are flexible are going to be faster, not slower than what we presently have. Mm-hmm. Correct? I mean, we're going to be installing batteries in all likelihood because building new thermal is impossible. Mm-hmm. Those batteries are inverter-based technology, which means that their ramp rate is instantaneous, compared to OTC resources that we're going to be retiring that have a fairly lengthy ramp rate. So if you still base on a 3-hour, as long as you meet the quantity of ramp that you need, you should have all the speed that's necessary. That's why I'm asking for the study results on this. So if it was in FRACMU 2, was it published?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So it's on the stakeholder site under FRACMU 2 somewhere? I'll take a look. Thanks.
Not in the last iteration, but I think the previous one.
Okay. And does that include the future state, or is it just the present?
It's just present state.
Okay. Is there something that's going to come out on the future state of what the fear is?
Yeah, in the future. Sorry. Stephen?
Stephen Kelly with IB. Carl, you may be going to address this, so I might be ahead of your slide presentation, but when you talk about flexible RA requirements, are you talking about how the ISO is going to be managing its real-time market and maybe CPM procurement, or are you talking about actual requirements imposed on LSEs in the RA framework?
This is all RA framework we're talking about here. All right. And again, we're coordinating with the day-ahead market enhancements how we manage the actual fleet of what's bidding and how that is being dispatched, but we're really staying in the RA space here. This is all planning horizon. Chris?
Christopher McLean, California Energy Commission staff. Will it always be the case that the delta T is a subset of the THCL range?
I want to make sure I'm understanding. I think I understand what you're saying. So are we going to go up and down so quickly?
It's always an hour within the 3, or could there be a 1-hour ramp requirement that's not embedded in the 3-hour ramp? I mean,
I suppose in theory it's possible. We've not
observed it. But you could program it to like always be inclusive of the 3 hours.
We could set that up to say, what is the, in the 3 hour, what is the steepest?
Yep.
That can be done. At this point in time, we've not identified or not observed anything where it's happening outside of it. I think the most likely scenario in which that might occur would be in the summer months. The reason I say that is because the net load ramp in the summer months is very just kind of long and smooth, and so the nonlinearity of the net load ramp is really sharp in the spring and winter months, and it's much smoother in the summer months. So you can have closer percentages in the summer months where, hey, it's 35, 32, and 33, and then, there's an hour in the morning that's just bigger than that. Yeah. So it is theoretically possible, but you're right, we can program it to keep it as subsets.
So I guess then just being clear about what the intention is, I think it's fine either way, but just being clear about whether or not it's confined to that range or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. So any other questions on the 3 requirements we've laid out? Okay. So now comes the challenging part, right, which is to say we want them to meet, we want the requirements for flexible RA to stand up to a few basic requirements. Again, this is some of the stuff that has worked well in our current flexible RA framework, which is to say we need these things to be, we need this capacity to be procurable in a bilateral framework. Again, we're not trying to create such complexity as to break bilateral procurement. We've had flexible RA, we had the 3 capacity categories. That was working. It was complex. We know, we heard, but we figured that kind of provided us with a framework of no more requirements than this, and so we're kind of sticking to that. Making sure that the requirements are well defined and that how procurement that is done will count towards meeting those requirements, and then trying to, again, I'm not going to stand up here and provide 100% mitigation from regulatory risk, but to the extent possible, we've provided sufficient certainty and clarity to those doing the procurement and potentially subject to deficiencies, a way to manage that. So with all that in mind, we are looking to simplify the existing flexible capacity requirements that we have. We're looking at the counting rules, the eligibility rules, and the offer obligations. These are all areas where we've had lots of questions and confusion about, how much does my resource count? What category am I in? What's my offer obligation? Is it, 17 by 5 or is it 5 by 5? What do I have to do? So we want to simplify this down. We'll talk about all of these elements as we go along. So one of the things that we have today is we have a process, a study process that has, by and large, as we've looked at it, worked, which is to say our flexible RA needs assessment is doing a pretty good job in determining what our flexible RA needs are. When we've done assessments of the 3-hour net load ramp relative to the needs, we find that we're coming within a couple percent, about 5%. Every now and again we're off by a little bit more than that, but we're by and large doing pretty well with some of the adjustments that we're talking about making in our study process. We think we can improve even on that. So we are going to talk about 2 changes really to the study process in determining particularly the long and fast ramping flexible RA needs. That's getting up to speed with the current WEC standards for what our requirements are for contingency reserves. Right now we based it on the old standard of 3.5%. We'll be updating that. And then as I was noting to Peter a moment ago, we'll be looking to make sure that when we calculate the needs, it's based on the full net load, not the observed net load. And what that really does, it actually facilitates a better accounting for what wind and solar can do in contributing to the resolution of the net load ramp. So in order to avoid double counting, we need to build back in any curtailed wind and solar capacity into that 3-hour net load ramp. So this should look pretty familiar to everybody. There's a few minor changes on here, again, minor though important, which is to say, excuse me, when we do the long ramping need, we'll identify that as the maximum forecasted 3-hour net load ramp, but that will include a reconstruction of the curtailed or not dispatched wind and solar capacity so that we see the net load will actually drop lower than what we've observed. But again, this is an actual real accounting of what net load would have been but for the participation and flexibility that wind and or solar provided to us. So again, this is simply our way of saying we recognize that they are providing flexible capacity today. Let's more accurately account for that and provide greater opportunity for them to do it in the future. So that's the including the reconstituted renewable curtailment section of this on the second line. And then the second part of this, note that we've simply substituted out half of the 6% monthly expected peak, which basically breaks down to 3%, which is comparable to what we've got today, just updated for the new standards. So this is what we're proposing for the long ramping flexibility needs. The other benefit of the flexibility study we run today is the data is compatible with also deriving the fast ramping needs for the largest forecasted 1-hour net load ramp. So again, we are looking at that as the fast ramping need. The thing that we're still trying to work through on this is some of the overlap between the reserves and the flexibility. Again, we had that in the initial, or in the current flexible program, where we understand that some of the resources that are providing reserves are also the flexible resources that we want. And so we have additional flexibility procurement to account for that. And it's just unclear to us right now if we need to have a similar consideration for the fast ramping product or if it's sufficiently covered by the long ramping product. And so we're kind of leaving that out there for stakeholders to provide input on. Do we need any additional considerations when looking at the fast ramping requirements? So I'm going to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions in the room, because again, I realize I'm moving expeditiously. A lot of this I think is not new material, but I also want to make sure that people have an opportunity to ask any and all questions they have. Phone questions? All right, let's go to the callers on the phone then.
Lauren, we'll take the question on the phone, please.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with Clica. Can you hear me okay?
We got you, Paul.
Hi. So back to the formula when you were talking about reconstituted for curtailed renewable. Can you specify what that means? Does that mean like negative bids that they were curtailed, or does this mean more of manual dispatches of the curtailment?
Yes.
So
the answer is both.
Both. Because if it's economic where they're bidding negative, then we're putting in a need that could create sort of a distortion, possibly, that you're making. If it's more expensive to purchase ramping need than the economic curtailment, then I'm not so sure that putting in the economic curtailment is appropriate.
It will be, Paul. I'll get to it in a moment. But as kind of a preview, because of how we're going to talk about how particularly solar resources will count towards meeting that requirement, putting it back in is really helpful in actually measuring what they're doing and then giving them credit for that economic bid, which is what the flexibility is providing. So I appreciate the concern, and when we come back around to talking about how we're dealing with solar in EFC space, if I've not answered that question to your satisfaction, please chime back in.
Okay. I look forward to hearing that then. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions in the room?
Lauren, any other questions on the phone?
No other questions on the phone.
Okay. Paper must have been really clearly written. starving. I just don't know how everybody else is doing. So moving on then, I think what we've talked about up to this point is kind of, again, a little bit of old hat, which is to say we kind of understand the current study process. We understand how deriving that short ramping need can be achieved through that study process. It's a little bit more complicated to talk about some of the uncertainty requirements that we're looking to address. And this is a bit newer subject matter. We've talked about it a little bit in the previous initiative, but obviously it's come back here. Now, we've talked about the idea of what that uncertainty is. The question that we're still trying to pin down, quite frankly, is how do we measure it? How do we provide that quantifiable number of this is how much uncertainty we're looking to address? So to provide at least an initial starting point, we understand that over time, as we have the imbalance reserves, we can start to use some of that historic data to drive the number, and some of these things can be revisited, but we don't have that now, and so we need to start from somewhere. So our initial proposal is to say that the uncertainty product would be a measurement that we'd look over 3 years of historic data to determine what the maximum differences that we're seeing between IFM and FMM forecasts, trying to measure the rate of change that we're seeing in those forecasts. Now, keeping in mind, we're always looking to improve our forecasts, and so hopefully driving those down so the rate of change need not be positive. It could actually be a decreasing need for uncertainty. That's possible. But we also need to recognize that we'll have to calculate what that forecast error might look like in a more uncertain fleet, which is to say our current data collection process for the flexible RA needs assessment now, we're collecting wind and solar futures, trying to see what's happening into the future. And so trying to utilize those growth factors of those resources that potentially contribute to our forecast error as well, we can try and grow that to mirror the data we've collected there. And then, again, try and extrapolate the uncertainty requirements for the upcoming RA year and set that as the requirement. So, again, trying to figure out how uncertainty is growing historically and then scale that growth relative to what we expect other contributors to that uncertainty to be. Now, again, we get it. We're not capturing all elements of the uncertainty in that measure. We're open to other things that we might include or might consider. But, again, we needed to start somewhere. So we're open to additional feedback on this and would love to hear what other folks have to say or think about how we're measuring uncertainty or thinking about uncertainty in the RA space. Vic?
Vic with Sandra Gas and Electric. Are you relying on the CEC for the load changes? I mean, we've got new time of use rates, we got electrification of transportation. A lot of things are also happening in the future besides, more wind and solar. Are you relying on the CEC forecast to have all those other aspects create the load that you're using?
Yes.
And you just focus on the supply then in this case?
So what we've used historically, and I think this year we changed and updated to utilizing the CEC's hourly load forecast. So that was what was used for the flexible RA process, and we'll continue to utilize that today. So anything they're seeing due to, for example, time of use or whatnot, that will be reflected in the load forecast we get from the CEC. Brian?
Thanks, Carl. Brian Baker with NRG. Does the ISO, as this initiative rolls out, intend to publish do some analysis and publish indicative numbers as to what these the different requirements might be?
I think we'll have to, yes. Okay. I mean, I don't think FERC would look at it and be like, oh, yeah, it's cool, you don't need to demonstrate that. I think that's kind of a prerequisite.
So next iteration, I mean, do you...
Well, again, we want to make sure that kind of before we go through the trials and tribulations of data analytics, we want to make sure that there's buy-in from stakeholders that, yeah, that's a good way to think about that, and that's the right way to drill down into that. If we've got vast disagreements on that, then we want to make sure that, before we endeavor into the data that...
Fair enough, but I would also point out that people, data analysis always, or not always, but sometimes provides a surprise, which is, gee, I didn't know it was going to yield that number.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a tension going on.
Yeah, and again, I'll refer folks to the Day-Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative, where we have put out some of the uncertainty numbers that they've measured there, the deltas between IFM and FMM, and again, some of the challenges, we were hoping to address in the granularity space between IFM and FMM with a 15-minute day ahead. That's still an issue now as we move forward with continued use of hourly dispatches for the day-ahead market. So again, we've got some information out there, but again, it still needs to be updated in the future. So I'm actually at a fairly decent breaking point in mind. If there's somebody on the phone.
Lauren, do we have a question in the queue?
We do have one caller.
Go ahead, caller. Still not hearing you. Caller, are you muted?
Sorry. Yeah, I was muted, but I think the system didn't automatically lower my hand after the last call, so I don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. All right. So I guess we're good then. So here's what I'm going to do. I actually have made a pretty good dent into our schedule. Again, I want to make sure everybody's walking away with an understanding here. The fact that we're moving a little bit more quickly through this, I think up to this point has been indicative of this is not earth-shatteringly new. But if there are questions, please stop me. Right now I'm going to stop me and say, let's take a lunch, and we'll come back and talk about some of the eligibility criteria and counting rules that we still need to go through. Lauren has informed me that she thinks she can move expeditiously through her section as well, so I think we'll go for a full hour lunch. Okay, so meet us back here at 1 o'clock, and we'll finish this flexibility stuff up and move on through the day. Thank you.